Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. The US says it has killed ISIS leader Abu Yusuf in an airstrike in Syria. It comes as US diplomats make a groundbreaking trip to Damascus. Meanwhile, two Turkish journalists covering the fight between Turkish-backed fighters and Syrian Kurdish militia are killed in northern Syria in a reported drone attack. A Donald Trump-backed spending bill fails in the US House of Representatives as dozens defy the president-elect. And Russia carry out cyber attacks on Ukraine state registries and fire missiles in Zelensky's hometown. To our top story, and the US claim they have killed ISIS leader Abu Yusuf during an airstrike in Syria. It comes as a group of American diplomats make a historic visit to Damascus. Barbara Leaf, the State Department's senior Middle East official, is leading the delegation, which also includes hostage envoy Roger Carstens and Daniel Rubinstein, who the Biden administration has tapped to lead talks with Syria's new administration, who toppled Bashar al-Assad's government last week. It's the first formal US diplomatic visit to the Syrian capital in more than a decade. Let's go live to Washington now and speak to our correspondent, Sally Patterson. Sally, thank you for joining us. In the last hour, the US says it has killed the leader of ISIS in Syria. There are concerns about the group's resurgence. Is this latest news a win for the Biden administration and the delegation who are currently in Damascus?
Well, we're hearing details coming about that strike, which killed ISIS leader in Syria, Abu Yusuf. That's what the United States says. They said another top ISIS official was killed in that targeted attack. Now, we've seen a US statement saying the United States, working with its allies and partners in the region, will not allow ISIS to take advantage of the current situation in Syria. And it alleges that ISIS had the intent to break out of detention over 8,000 ISIS operatives being held in facilities in Syria. And what we can confer from this targeted strike is that this is a real show of power, really, by the administration here in the US to show that despite the chaos unraveling in Syria, the different groups who are perhaps vying for power there, the US is not going to sit back and let that happen. They say they're going to go in with a heavy fist and really target those groups that have been on their radar for several years now. And this, they feel, is the opportunity to really go in and strike while the iron's hot.
Show of power, as you say there, but the US is keen to maintain relations in the region. What are they working towards? What's the overall goal?
Well, I think we can look at this trip going on as we speak in two parts. Firstly, US officials say they're there to meet with the de facto leaders currently in place, HTS. This is one of the first times that we're seeing this real normalization of contact between those leaders now in Syria and the United States. So it's really a pretty big moment for those relations and what the future of that relationship might look like. And we saw a statement coming out last Saturday from the US as well as several other countries, Arab nations, the United Kingdom, the European Union as well, which talked about wanting to ensure that the next government of Syria is inclusive. It holds space for all of the different groups in the country as well. And that's a narrative that we're seeing coming out from the US, this sense that whatever happens now, it needs to take into account all of those different groups, those minority groups in particular, currently living in Syria, and it needs to be a representative government. That's what that statement said. Now, we also understand that as part of this delegation, there is going to be a concerted effort to meet with Syrian people themselves, whether those are civil society actors, leaders from minority groups as well, to understand what they want the future of Syria to look like.
Just in 60 seconds, can you round up something for us? When it comes to Washington as well as London, it still designates HTS as a terror organisation. Is this visit a sign that they could prepare to delist the group?
That's right. The US, in a way, is in a relatively tricky spot because they're going to have negotiations with leaders who they have decided is a terrorist organization, and that's because they broke away from Al-Qaeda. That was the group's foundations. Now, that group is very strong in its saying that it's no longer part of that group. It says it is not a terrorist organization. It says it has made many changes. It says, for example, that it will continue to support women's education in Syria and support women's rights in the country, respect the rights of minority groups as well. But we need to remember that Donald Trump, the president-elect of the United States, is coming back into office in a month's time. And it was under his first term that the group was designated a terrorist organization. And so it's really going to be up to him to decide what the future of those negotiations and those relationships look like, and whether the HTS has done enough to distance itself from those terrorist roots and prove that it is a player that can meet those others on a world stage.
Sally Patterson in Washington, thank you so much for joining us. Turkish President Erdogan has said terrorist groups which threaten Syria's survival, such as ISIS and the Kurdish PKK and its affiliates, must be eradicated. Sporadic fighting continues in the country's northeast between the US-backed Syrian Democratic Forces, where 2 Kurdish journalists were also reportedly killed by a Turkish drone strike earlier this morning. Erdogan has taken a hard line publicly, but negotiations with Washington are ongoing over the role of the SDF and their autonomous governance in a new Syrian state following the downfall of Bashar al-Assad. For more on this, I'm joined from Washington by Mutlu Civiroglu, a Kurdish affairs analyst and VOA journalist. Mutlu, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Turkish President Erdogan said earlier today that terrorist groups such as ISIS and the PKK, which threaten Syria's existence, must be eradicated. Does this suggest an offensive is still on the cards?
Yes. When we weigh the statement, it appears so. But when you look at the reality, ISIS indeed is a threat. And just today, like you guys also covered, CENTCOM announced a leader was killed. In the recent months, ISIS have been trying to build up, reconstruct its power, make a comeback, getting advantage of this situation, post-Assad situation. Yes, as ISIS is certainly a threat. But in terms of PKK, that's really not true. The PKK in Syria, no, the Turkish government, Mr. Erdogan, equalizes SDF with PKK. But many people believe this is just a pretext to make a ground operation, military operation. So the SDF has been there fighting against ISIS, has been a major force for stabilizing Syria, not destabilizing. SDF are made of people, Syrian people, Kurds, Arabs, Turkmens, Yazidis, Christians, Syriacs. So it's made of Syrian people, by Syrian people, for the lands of Syria. So that's really hard to understand. But looking at Washington and other capitals, this argument really does not have base, and it's not supported. That nobody believes that the SDF, the Kurdish political and military establishment, has any threat to anyone.
Negotiations with Washington are still going on at the moment over the future of the Kurdish-controlled enclave in northeast Syria. But fighting is ongoing, as we know. What are some of the possible terms being discussed to bring about an end to the fighting?
Yeah, right before I joined you, I had some news that the very fierce clashes are taking place at the moment around Kobani. You're right, near the Tishrin Karakozak bridge that connects Minbic to Kobani. So there has been very fierce fighting. And you also mentioned in the broadcast 2 journalists were killed with the Turkish drone star in the same area. And one of them was I know them both. I talked with them all. They were, journalists. But Nazım, the male journalist, was a great journalist. I met him during the Bakos operation when ISIS caliphate was ended by SDF, by the US-led international coalition. So these two journalists are the most recent victim of this tension. What needs to be done? The Turkish government shouldn't see existence of Kurds as a threat. I talked to Ms. İlham Ahmet a few days ago, one of the Syrian Kurdish leaders. She reiterated again that they are not threat against Turkey. They want a good relationship with Turkey. Everybody I talk to, they say these things, that they are not a threat. They have never been a threat. Today I talked to Kobani. I shared a video. Maybe your viewers have seen that. It's a peaceful city, harmless city. There has never been one bullet shot to Turkey from Kobani or anywhere else. So there is no good to increase the tension for anyone. Syria, after Assad, Syria is now looking for opening a new page. There was optimism, there was hope, but such an operation would cause more catastrophe, more devastation, more displaced people. The Kurds have already announced that. Mr. Mazlum Abdi, SDF general, that if Turkey is concerned with Kobani, we are ready to leave it, pull our forces and leave it to the internal police under the supervision of the US. So he has, the international media, he announced that, this kind of suggestion. So I think what Kurds are doing to do their best to assure any concerns that their neighbors have. In this context, they are doing their best to extend this to Turkey as well. But Turkey seems like very motivated to do such an operation. Now Turkey feels upper-handed. Turkey feels emboldened after the recent developments, topple of Bashar Assad. He's opening a new page, groups under his or direct or indirect control being powerful. I think Turkey is very eager to expand its control in the lands, in Syrian lands. That's why they are using existence of PKK in Syria. But the leaders I talk to, political military leaders I talk to in a daily basis, the regular people I talk to, they strongly denounce that. They strongly deny that. And yesterday, probably you covered, there was some mass demonstration in support of SDF. People of the region took the streets with SDF flags and with the new Syrian flags supporting SDF. SDF has not come from anywhere else. This has to be, clearly understood by everyone. They are the people of Kamışlı, Hasaka, Kobani, Afrin, Manbij, Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor. They are from that area. They have never come from anywhere else. They are the local people. SDF being there has been a stabilizing power, like I said. Thanks to SDF's YPG's work, thousands of people, if not hundreds of thousands of people, didn't go, became refugees, became IDPs. They're still in there. So this is not going to help anyone. The ISIS threat is real. CENTCOM has been warning for months that the situation is critical.
Mutlu, thank you so much for your views on that this evening. I do apologise, we have now run out of time, but that was Mutlu Civiroglu, a Kurdish affairs analyst and VOA journalist. Thank you for those insights this evening.
Thank you.
Staying with Syria, and the UN's Refugee Agency expects 1 million people to return to the country in the next few months. Thousands of Syrians sought asylum in the UK, where thousands more also study and work. With preparations for a new government in Damascus underway, Stuart Smith spoke to Syrian communities in London about their hopes for the future.
As Syrians in Damascus celebrate the fall of the Assad dynasty, over 3,000 kilometres away in London, many share their optimism.
Absolutely happy, because we wait this since 2011, since the situation started. So we are so happy. If you ask any Syrian people, no more dictatorial, freedom now. So absolutely happy.
I am very happy and pleased that the Assad regime left us, and we are now in very good condition. I mean very good condition, and in good health. Security has returned to our country. They have returned everything to our country.
Some want to go back, but after so many years, a lot of them don't have homes or jobs to go back to. The UK has paused asylum applications from Syrian nationals while the picture back home becomes clearer, with both London and the UNHCR saying it's too early to know if Syria is safe. When there's more certainty about what happens next, computer engineer Hashem is considering starting a new life there after 15 years away.
Actually, it's quite sudden. The whole process is quite sudden, and people are still processing what happened. And they are planning to be some balance between living in the UK, living in Syria in general.
I would prefer to return to my country after maybe a year or two, when the circumstances will improve. I will return to my country because in the end, a person has nothing but his homeland, his home, and his family. I mean, I do not prefer to be an expatriate, living alone abroad and dying alone abroad.
Elections have been promised by the de facto government in Syria, which could be the first step towards a functioning state, but there's a long way to go to rebuild.
The Syrian embassy in London remains closed since the ambassador was expelled in 2012, but a flag now hangs here for the first time in over a decade, though bearing 3 stars instead of 2.
The flag that's become synonymous with anti-Assad forces is a sign change is coming, and Syrians in London are hopeful it will bring good things, but many here are staying put until they know for sure. Stuart Smith, Arabiya News, London.
To the US now, and a government shutdown looks likely after a funding bill backed by Donald Trump failed to pass the House of Representatives. Some within his own Republican Party defied the president-elect, leaving lawmakers until midnight to work out a new deal on all sides, which all sides can agree on. Nick Harper has this report from Washington.
The bill is not passed.
The shutdown showdown. Late on Thursday, the US House voted down the deal, leaving the Republican House Speaker with some explaining to do.
This is Washington. This is how the lawmaking is done. It's a long process. Sometimes it takes a while to reach consensus.
But time is no longer on the lawmakers' side. They have just hours until the US government runs out of money. At 12:01 a.m. on Saturday, federal agencies will be forced to close, leaving hundreds of thousands of employees without pay just ahead of the holidays. But rewind to earlier this week, and the Democrats and Republicans had a bipartisan deal.
Take over, Elijah, take over.
But incoming President Donald Trump, egged on by Elon Musk, told Republicans to reject it. They blasted concessions given to Democrats and demanded the debt ceiling be raised, making it easier for Trump to implement dramatic tax cuts when president. Under pressure from the president-elect, the deal fell apart, exasperating Democrats.
One or two puppet masters weigh in, and the extreme MAGA Republicans decide to do the bidding of the wealthy, the well-off, the well-connected millionaires and billionaires, not working-class people.
A new, hastily arranged proposal, increasing the government's borrowing limit to 2027, was rejected in that Thursday evening vote, with dozens of Republicans refusing to back a bill that raises the debt ceiling without substantial spending cuts. It was a stinging rebuke for the incoming president and ups the ante on getting a deal done in time. Now, a nightmare before Christmas, as lawmakers scramble to do a deal and avoid a shutdown. They had been hoping to pass that bipartisan bill and head home for the holidays. But hours of talks and negotiations now lie ahead, with the political brinksmanship and furious partisan blame game only increasing. Nick Harper, Arabiya News, Washington.
Let's take a look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. Lord Peter Mandelson, one of the best-known figures in British politics, will become the UK's next ambassador to the US. He'll be installed in Washington, D.C. following incoming US President Donald Trump's inauguration on the 20th of March. Mandelson previously spoke out against Trump's hostile relationship with China, calling him a bully for fueling trade wars.
You solemnly swear.
In Mayotte, an angry crowd booed and called for French President Emmanuel Macron to resign after he visited the region with aid and supplies. following the destruction of Cyclone Chido. Macron decided to extend his visit to the island to inspect other affected areas. Officials in France's porous overseas territory have confirmed 31 fatalities and 2,500 injured. Sir Paul McCartney has reunited with his former Beatles bandmate Sir Ringo Starr during a gig at London's O2 Arena. The last time the pair played together was in 2019 during McCartney's Freshen Up tour. And a couple from India's southern state of Karnataka have taken legal action against each other and even considered a divorce regarding their baby's name. The unnamed mother refused to accept the name her husband had chosen for their child and had to get a court to intervene. The couple have now agreed to call their son Arivancharara, which means of nobility, and they've decided to continue with their marriage. To Ukraine, and Russia has carried out a mass cyber attack on the country's state registries, according to the Deputy Prime Minister. Details about Ukrainian citizens' births, deaths, marriages and property ownership have all been affected. Ukraine believes the attack was specifically targeted to disrupt the work of the country's infrastructure. Meanwhile, Russian missiles were fired earlier this morning into cities of Kyiv and Kryvyi. One person died, many others were left injured, and buildings were badly damaged. Kryvyi, where a man and a teenage girl were pulled from the rubble, is home to Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. Let's go live to Kyiv to speak to our correspondent, Alex Cadier, who's there for us. Alex, let's start with the cyber attacks. Ukraine has said Russia's spy agency was behind it and criminal proceedings have now started. How damaging was that attack and what's been done to rectify the situation now?
Well, it's been described as the largest cyber attack on Ukraine from Russia in recent memory. That's according to the Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine, who is also the Justice Minister in this government, saying that it shut down state registries and online services like marriage registrations and car registrations and the kind of everyday services that you would do online with government services. So certainly a big attack. It's been attributed by the Ukrainians to the Russian a hacking group associated to the Russian military intelligence, the GRU, which we know has been behind a lot of cyber attacks on Ukraine. There has been an exchange, certainly since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, of cyber attacks between Ukraine and Russia. There will be, of course, increased security, but what we understand from Ukrainian officials is that no data was leaked. Crucially, they say that that was the idea behind this attack, to get public records of Ukraine. None of that was leaked, but it may take a couple of weeks to get all these services back online, which would suggest some kind of massive security shutdown in the face of this cyber attack. Ukraine, an increasingly online government, increasingly government services are online, and therefore this cyber attack will be taken incredibly seriously.
What's the situation like on the ground in Kyiv after this morning's ballistic missile attack in the city?
Well, the city was rocked by explosions just about a couple kilometers from where I'm standing right now. A series of explosions, including that strike. We know that one person was killed and about a dozen were injured, 5 of which were rushed to hospital. A tense day in this city, but certainly something that people from Kyiv are used to experiencing. We were at the scene about an hour after the strike, and the damage was very significant. We saw residential buildings completely stripped of all their windows, shattered in the front of a large hotel as well near that location, as well as a building holding the embassies of Portugal, Argentina, Morocco. This building was also damaged. Those windows were blown in by the blast. Now, Ukrainians Air Force saying that 5 ballistic missiles targeted this city. All of them were shot down, but debris fell onto the city, causing fires. We saw dozens of cars burnt out on the street, and as I said, extensive damage, including to a church, a cathedral, I should say, in Kyiv as well. So certainly a very tense day, worrying that damage can still be struck so deep into the center of Kyiv, and that will be playing on the minds of people as they go into their weekend. This alert started very early this morning. We now worry about tomorrow morning.
Alex, Ukraine has revealed today that Russia has suffered its worst daily losses since the full-scale invasion began. 2,200 Russian troops have died in the last 24 hours. Are people wondering how long this can physically go on for?
Well, the last record was just over 2,000. That was back at the end of November. So certainly those Russian casualties, according to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, seem to be increasing, certainly trending upwards. Military experts very clear that this is just the way Russia wages war, what they call the meat grinder approach of just throwing as many soldiers, often not very well trained, into the conflict, many of which losing their lives, as we heard, 2,200 in 24 hours. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that Ukraine has the upper hand. They are still massively outnumbered, even though the casualty numbers, according to the Institute for the Study of Wars, is about 1 to 5, so 1 Ukrainian soldier for 5 Russian soldiers. They're still massively outnumbered, and we've seen that, the Ukrainian army withdrawing from a pocket near the town of Pokrovsk because they were at the risk of being encircled. We are very much in an attritional, slow phase of this war, but just because the line isn't moving as much as it could, that doesn't make this any less brutal a war. So certainly on the front line, slow but very violent.
Alex Cadier in Kyiv, thank you for joining us. Let's take a look at the top business news. Starbucks baristas are holding a 5-day strike in the US, which could reach hundreds of stores by Christmas Eve if a deal over work and pay isn't reached. A union representing more than 11,000 workers say the walkouts will begin across Los Angeles, Chicago and Seattle before spreading across the country. It follows a union calling for Starbucks to raise wages and also staffing, as well as implement better schedules for its workers. Now, UK government borrowing fell to £11.2 billion in November, the lowest figure for the month in 3 years, according to the Office for National Statistics. Debt interest was down £4.7 billion from a year earlier to £3 billion, mainly due to lower inflation, providing a boost for British Chancellor Rachel Reeves. Separate figures also from the ONS today showed retail sales rose slightly last month, helped by stronger trading at supermarkets. Now let's turn to some sports news. Tyson Fury and Alexander Usyk shared an astonishing 11-minute face-off in one of the most remarkable head-to-heads in boxing history. Both heavyweights meet again on Saturday night in Riyadh as Fury bids for revenge and heavyweight gold. Ukraine's Usyk narrowly outpointed the self-appointed Gypsy King back in May, becoming the first undisputed heavyweight champion in 24 years. And Tottenham has survived a Manchester United comeback to reach League Cup semi-finals with a 4-3 win at home. The game was a gripping tie littered with bizarre errors from Tottenham's goalkeeper Fraser Foster, who allowed United a lifeline. But 2 goals from Dominic Solanke kept Spurs out in front. Arsenal will face Newcastle United in the other semi-final. A reminder of our top stories. The US says it has killed ISIS leader Abu Yusuf in an airstrike in Syria. It comes as US diplomats make a groundbreaking trip to Damascus. Meanwhile, 2 Turkish journalists covering the fight between Turkish-backed fighters and Syrian Kurdish militia are killed in northern Syria in a reported drone attack. A Donald Trump-backed spending bill fails in the US House of Representatives as dozens defy the president-elect. And Russia carry out cyber attacks on Ukraine's state registries and fire missiles in Zelensky's hometown. That's all from us on W News. Thanks for joining us. Riz Khan is coming up next. And don't miss Tom Burges Watson with GNT. Good night.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello, I'm Riz Khan. Welcome to the show. From Australia to the US, 300 million people around the world live in jurisdictions that allow residents a choice to end their lives prematurely in order to escape the pain and indignity of a protracted death. The UK Parliament recently became the latest legislature to take a step towards legalising assisted dying in England and Wales. MPs were freed from party loyalties for an emotional, respectful debate that contrasted with the political combat that often punctuates the House of Commons. At its conclusion, a majority voted in favour of a bill that would permit some adults to use drugs prescribed to end their lives. But there were conditions. They would have to be diagnosed as terminally ill with no more than 6 months to live, mentally capable of making the decision, and free from coercion to do so. Well, the bill must pass several more rounds of intense scrutiny from parliamentarians before it can become law. But the issue sparked a passionate national debate with voices from different perspectives raising matters of ethics, faith and justice. At the same time, philosophers were preparing to cross continents for a conference in the Saudi capital, Riyadh, to discuss quality of life. In this episode, we'll consider attitudes to life and death from an ethical, practical and philosophical point of view. Dame Esther Ranson is a celebrated British journalist and activist whose TV show, That's Life, ran for over 20 years, reaching audiences of more than 20 million viewers. Her campaigns have helped save children from abuse and the elderly from neglect. But now in her 80s, she's become a prominent figure in the campaign for assisted dying after revealing she's received a terminal cancer diagnosis. Her daughter and fellow campaigner, Rebecca Wilcox, joins me now. Rebecca Wilcox, it's really good to have some time with you, and it's sad that we're talking under these circumstances, but it's a very important subject. So for people like myself, we grew up seeing your mother, and half the country pretty much tuned into her every week on TV. And she was known as quite a staunch campaigner. Now, she bettered a lot of lives through those campaigns, and it seems she's taken on this one last campaign. I think you described it as her last campaign at your peril, something like that.
Yes, I said she doesn't want this to be known as her final campaign because there's still life in the old bird yet, is what she would say. And I would possibly get smacked over the head for saying that. Obviously, she doesn't agree with violence.
Now, the world got to know about Dame Esther's cancer when she revealed it on an interview that she had terminal cancer. And she also revealed that she was going to Dignitas, or signing up with Dignitas, the service in Switzerland that assists dying. Now, as your family would have already been aware, it seemed that her considerations were not so much for herself, but more about the impact it would have on the people around her, the people that she loved, perhaps facing prosecution for being involved in any way, as is the case with the law. So how did you and your family respond to your mother's decision?
It was an interesting one because whilst I've always been aware of her feelings towards end-of-life care and choice at the end of your life, I had no idea that she had signed up to Dignitas until she revealed it on a podcast. And I think a journalist rang me and asked me for a comment, which is pretty standard for growing up with my parents. being in the public eye as they were. And so it wasn't a massive surprise, but it was, and it's in keeping with everything I know about her, but it was weirdly shocking because I felt that she wasn't near the end of her life. I felt that the treatment was going well. I love living in denial. It's not healthy. It's not good for you. I would never recommend it, but it helps me get through the day just to pretend that everything is okay. And the fact that she had gone about this with meticulous care and sorted out a future for herself that wouldn't hurt us showed how seriously she was taking this illness. I like to think of her as immortal and indomitable, and I think that was a bit of a shocking moment for me. I felt the rug pulled out.
There was also a massive reaction in the British media. There was a huge reaction with the public. Was Dame Esther surprised? Was she energized or perhaps concerned at being part of this debate?
I think she accidentally fell into this debate and then realized it was meant to be. She sort of has an ability for touching on the zeitgeist. So I would say that happened when she did Child Watch, and out of that came Childline, the helpline for children. And when she wrote an article about loneliness, she received so many letters in response to that she set up Silverline, which was a helpline for older people who were feeling similar feelings. And then she talked about this, and it was absolutely the right time for the country to start considering it again. It had been 2015 when it was last debated in Parliament. It had sort of plateaued. And I think she lit a fire under it. And once she realized that this decision that she made for herself could help other people, that's always been her goal. She's never done anything for herself at the detriment for other people. She suddenly realized this was a subject that needed talking about. It needed airing. We need to talk about end-of-life care. Even if you disagree with the assisted dying bill, we need to talk about what happens at the end of your life, because sadly, we are all going to die. So your family need to know what you want, what care you want, what choices you want to make. And that's what this bill is about. It's about giving you further choices in that matter.
Rebecca, your mother's not known for doing anything half-heartedly. And apparently she contacted every member of Parliament in the UK government before the debate. Is that the case?
Oh, yes, absolutely. She knew that she wasn't physically able to go to the debate. She sent me in her stead, and I sat at the top and sat on my hands and tried not to shout at people when I assumed that they were saying something that I disagreed with or she disagreed with me. And because she couldn't be there, she sent this heartfelt letter filled with comment and fact that she really hoped they would sit and listen to, because that's what she wanted. She wanted everybody in the room to listen to the other side, regardless of the point of view that you come into the room with. Listen to the other side and then make a choice. We know that the public are majority in favour of changing the rules around assisted dying. We just wanted that reflected in the room.
Now, Rebecca, your father, Desmond Wilcox, is also a renowned journalist and filmmaker. I gather both he and your mother had touched on this subject in documentaries in the past. Tell us about that.
They were trailblazers. They would go where subjects hadn't gone before. They didn't mind talking about the things that were difficult. So it doesn't surprise me at all that they covered this subject. Most recently, Mum made a series called How to Have a Good Death. And it was a really interesting eye-opener for her. And I think paved the way for this campaign, because she saw people suffer in a way that was not palatable, for want of a better word, and could not be helped by palliative care. She saw people's shunts fall out, and she saw people's morphine drop off, and she saw people's pain surpass the opioid barrier. And I think that created a deep-seated belief in her that she did not want to go that way, that she wanted something far more peaceful. And my father felt the same way. He had a DNR, he had a do not resuscitate, that was very clear. And I remember in the hospital when he was dying, they were trying to resuscitate him, and Mom was screaming at me on the phone because she had popped home to change her outfit. Not out of it, that sounds ridiculous. She'd popped home to refresh herself because we'd been there a few hours, and unfortunately she wasn't there as he started crashing. So she's screaming at me on the phone that he has a DNR, he has a DNR. And I wasn't able to, or I couldn't, some reason it felt wrong for me to stop the medical process, but actually that's what he wanted. And I really hope that I would be brave enough to do that now. But he never wanted to have a catastrophic brain injury from lack of oxygen, which was what was happening, and therefore live in a vegetative state. He wanted to have a good death, which is what the Health and Social Care Select Committee report talked about. And Mum absolutely echoed that. So their work throughout their lives always touched on difficult subjects and brilliant people talking about difficult things. And I'm not surprised they ended up with the decisions they ended up with.
It was a very difficult situation, of course, you found yourself in, and there are many perspectives on this subject, with some people very, very heavily opposed to it. They see it as assisted suicide, rather than just assisted dying. And I wonder, your mother would have heard a number of these arguments. Was she ever swayed by some of these viewpoints? Did it affect her in any way?
She has listened. She has listened. What she asked of the MPs to listen to her point of view, she has listened to other people. Otherwise, she is not the fair and rational woman that we know and love. She absolutely understands that people have differing points of view, that some people see that there's a sanctity of life, that some people see that there could be a coercive nature to this, that vulnerable elements of our society could be put at risk. But she and I have both looked through all the evidence and know that choice, according to the bill that has been set out, has an amazing set of safeguards around it. The safeguards are the cornerstone of this bill. At the moment, there aren't safeguards. At the moment, we're sort of living in a weird Wild West because nobody knows what to do and the law is a mess. So things can happen without regulation, whereas this would bring in regulation and legislation, and people would be able to monitor it very closely. I mean, it asks for the person that's asking to have an assisted death to apply 8 separate times. And those 8 separate times are scrutinised by doctors and lawyers or judges, depending upon how it proceeds with the committee stages. So there was no way that we didn't listen to other people's point of view, but the thing that kept coming back to us was this is choice, and faith is always choice. And I have many family members who are strong believers in the sanctity of life, but they would never believe that my mum should live in suffering and a prolonged existence just because of their faith.
Actually, you raise an interesting point there, Rebecca, and having spoken to people who are opposed to the bill, and you yourself will know the arguments very well, I'm sure, that issue of being coerced by others prematurely to end one's life, or even perhaps self-coercion came up. The idea that people might be guilty enough and feel that they need to end their lives because of pressure and burden they might put on others, came up also in the debate. And I wonder, did that issue ever come up among your family members?
What I would say about that is that there was an MP that stood up during the debate, and he said, this is not life or death, this is death or death. It was such a clear, bold statement that I hadn't heard before. I've heard people talk about this is not ending life, this is shortening death, but it makes it really clear that this is for terminal patients, people who have 6 months, 12 months left to live. It is not for somebody that is considered a burden on society. What a revolting phrase that is. Anybody that thinks they are a burden on society needs to have an adjusted view, because we need to value everybody, regardless of whatever supposed cost they may have. Everybody has a right to life. Kit Malthouse, the MP, said that we are not a nation of granny killers. And I think that is true. I think we, in the main, generally, absolutely adore our elders and respect them and look after them.
It's interesting, Rebecca, you raised that issue of safeguards, the safeguards that are there already, and the fact some are worried of the bill, allowing the scope to widen. And I wonder, if you could see any other potential safeguards that might really add another lock to the idea that the bill couldn't go any wider.
Well, I'm not a lawmaker. I'm not very well versed in politics. I've come to this very green, and it's been a very steep education for me in how contrary points of view can cause such emotive arguments. I've had a lot of threats against my life, against my family's safety, just because I believe in choice at the end of this world. So at the end of your life. So it's an interesting one for me that you talk about safeguards, when the people that are throwing around the violent terms are usually on the opposite side to me. We turn up to every debate, every campaign, every rally I'm alongside a campaign called Dignity in Dying, and that's exactly how we try and proceed at all these rallies, with dignity, with compassion, with empathy, and we're hugging each other and we're chatting to each other. And I'm alongside people who are really suffering from very serious terminal diagnoses, including this wonderful woman called Sophie who has stage 4 terminal breast cancer and is allergic to opioids. So at the end of her life, she sees nothing but pain. She cannot have any pain relief. So how does the gentle death of palliative care work for someone like her? With the safeguards that we want, I think this is the most safe bill. In fact, there have been criticisms of it for having too many safeguards. I think at the moment, with the country not decided, with a bit of a rift going on, even though the majority are in favour of it, I think it's good to proceed with this level of safety at this time.
Referring to the stage where things are right now, you indicated your mother was unable to go for the first vote. You were there. How did both of you and your mother, react to the outcome?
It was so strange being there for the debate. I mean, it was a phenomenal moment that I will never, ever forget. It's an extraordinary place, as I'm sure you know, and it was filled to the rafters, which on a Friday is apparently quite unusual. There was not an ounce of seating left. And at the end of this very, very detailed debate that lasted 5 hours, and everyone said that was really short, I'm not sure I could have stood another 2 hours of it. But I know that there were more people that wanted to stand up and speak. But at the end of the debate, when they all went out to vote and the speaker shouted out the results, and then there was silence. And I looked across to someone who was sat on the opposite side, who I knew supported my point of view, and he put 2 thumbs up. And I was so relieved he did, because the silence meant that I wasn't sure what had happened, because usually there's a hurrah from whoever wins. But it's such a serious subject. And at the end of the day, if we win, or, it doesn't feel like winning. It just feels like the ability to choose has been given to you to die. That is not something you cheer. Obviously, it's not. That's why it was taken so seriously. So I leapt out of the room and ran down the stairs. There is absolutely no phone signal anywhere in the Houses of Parliament. So I had to run to the river to get through to Mum, where I spoke to her, and I felt dizzy and sick and confused, and she and I were both echoing this. It's brilliant, it's amazing, thank goodness it's got through this stage, but wow, there's a lot of work left to do. Goodness, there were a lot of people that were putting up barriers to it already, and and then she said to me, "Oh, I feel like I have to live for the next one now." I said, "Yes, of course you do, but you don't have to live for the next debate. You have to live forever for us, your family, and maybe think about the debate."
Rebecca, you said you talked about how your mother reacted when you called her when you got out the Houses of Parliament to the River Thames to get a signal. And she said, the next one is coming up. So, of course, I guess you both recognise that at this stage it could be passed, it could be amended, it could even fail. Having played such a big part in the campaign, doesn't your mother want to kind of take a step back and rest and enjoy the rest of her life?
I tell you, she says to me, "I'm so bored with talking about dying." So I think she probably does, but I also think that she won't, because that's not the sort of person that she is. I don't think she'll let go of this. I think, we've both received so many messages and letters and emails from families that are going through very similar situations to us, that don't have the privilege of being able to afford the £15,000 to fly off to Switzerland, that are facing whatever will happen here and have no way out, or who have been through it before, who have either been to Switzerland or who have come across a loved one who is attempting suicide or has a botched suicide attempt. There's so many awful stories that are rolling around our heads, and so many people that we know are dependent upon this bill, that I don't think there's any way that we could stop now. The next stage is very difficult. It's the committee stage. The bill will be gone through line by line by line, and I can only hope it gets through. It's weird how our country is so recalcitrant on this topic, whereas we are leaders in so many other areas of health and social care. So I just hope that we are a bit more open to another way of looking at this.
Your mother mentioned in a recent interview that you'll be hosting the family Christmas event this year. I mean, assuming she is able to come, what will Christmas with Esther Ransom be like this year? And what memories do you have of Christmases together?
Yes, I'm going to be hosting my mum and my sister at some point over the Christmas period. They're going to come and stay. We haven't worked out the logistics yet, but I'm definitely, whenever that is, we'll have a massive turkey. I think I've ordered 3. I don't know how much turkey one person can eat, but her plate is going to be full. She doesn't have much of an appetite at the moment, but she's going to have every single trimming, every single type of stuffing, many types of Brussels sprouts, because we have quite a few opinions on how those should be cooked. Christmas with Esther is always fun. It's magical. She's naughty. She's brilliant. She's fun. She loves games. So we're going to play all sorts of games. I've got some fantastic new board games, competitive and not so. Anyone that takes her on in Scrabble, good luck to you. I have never won against her, but it's just going to be lovely. And I've bought her some excessively luxurious presents, which I hope she won't mind, and many gorgeous fluffy slippers. So please don't tell her I've done that too. And I'm decorating absolutely every surface of my house. There is not one vertical, horizontal, diagonal that isn't covered in glitter and gold. So it's a bit much, but I love it.
I'm sure, Rebecca Wilcox, that pretty much everyone is wishing you and your family and your mother especially a wonderful Christmas celebration this year. Your mother, for people of my generation, I can say almost unanimously was a national treasure, has been a national treasure. And it's incredibly impressive that she's still doing so much to this stage. So more power to you, more power to her, and I wish you well.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and I'll pass on the message.
Polls show that around 2/3 of British people supported the idea of legalising some form of assisted dying. But it's the members of Parliament who will ultimately decide whether and in what form such a law can proceed. The bill was brought before the House of Commons by the Labour Party MP Kim Leadbeater, who only entered politics 3 years ago after her sister Jo Cox MP was murdered. My next guest is also a Labour MP, but he voted against the bill. Barry Gardner's history of service spans more than a quarter of a century, and as he told me, his decision was made after much soul-searching. Barry Gardner, thank you very much for joining the show. Now, when you entered Parliament in 1997 as a young MP, what sense did you have you'd be involved in debates of such importance to the national conscience?
I think anyone who thinks about going into politics, national politics, has to realize that there will be times when they are considering issues which really are about life or death. In my own parliamentary career, I've had that on a number of occasions. We've had, obviously, debates on war. We've had debates previously on assisted dying. So it's something which everyone who goes into politics at that level really should have at the forefront of their mind. And they should have thought very deeply about it. And I think that was one of the features of the recent debate that we had. It was a very thoughtful debate.
You voted against the bill and spoke in the debate. What key points did you want to make?
I think it's important that we recognize that when we're legislating, we are not simply expressing our own personal preference. And this was the fundamental internal conflict that I had with myself, because I could envisage myself being in that situation as outlined in this bill, with perhaps 6 months yet to live, with a terminal disease, and depending on the nature of that disease, perhaps wanting to avail myself of what this law would propose, which is to be able to have an assisted death. So at a personal level, I could see that. And I also listened very carefully to the stories of many of my colleagues and some of my constituents whose family members had been in that position, but hadn't been able to avail themselves of an assisted death. Some who'd taken their own life, but hadn't been able to have their final goodbyes with their family, because that would have implicated their family in assisting suicide, which is a criminal offense. So I had to think very hard about, was it my role to enact a law which would certainly bring comfort and relief to those people, or was it my role as a parliamentarian to pass legislation for the whole of society? And my fear was that if we passed the legislation that would undeniably bring that comfort and relief for so many, but I believe it would also have jeopardized those people who were, yes, in the situation at the end of their life with 6 months yet to live, but who thought, am I too much of a burden on my family? Should I just now opt for an early death? Is my living for another 6 months in this care home or with this care support going to eat so much up of the inheritance that my grandchildren might have on my death that I'm denying them their inheritance? And those are considerations that nobody at the end of their life should have to take into account.
Now, you're referring to guilt.
Misplaced guilt, because there is no guilt in living. You know, you're not guilty for being alive. You are a valued, a treasured human being. And where we lose our capacity to see each other as that, then our society really has changed fundamentally.
But Mr. Gardner, in terms of not having somewhere to go, there are people, such as the famous British broadcaster Esther Rantzen, who's in her mid-80s and suffering from lung cancer, who said if she doesn't have the option in the UK, she'll go to Switzerland, to Dignitas, an organisation that does offer assisted dying. So by not giving them the option in the UK, aren't you simply driving them out?
Well, no, it doesn't force them out, but what it does, unfortunately, and here I feel this very keenly, the point that you make, because as Esther Rantzen wrote to me, as she did to many MPs, and her own witness, her own testimony of her situation was very powerful. And she made the point, I have the luxury, I am wealthy enough to be able to go to Switzerland, but there are people who are not. And therefore, at the moment, as the law stands, as a rich person, I can avail myself of the remedy that I want. I can exercise the choice that I wish to make, but a poor person cannot. And that's a very powerful argument. But as I say, I don't think it overrides the responsibility that I certainly felt to legislate for everyone in society and not just for those who felt themselves in that particular situation as wanting to have the assisted death.
It's interesting to note that this debate comes at a time when Britain has evolved into a multicultural and multi-faith society with representations of those groups in Parliament too. And I wonder, when it comes to religion and faith, in many cases assisted dying is seen as suicide, which is considered a sin, how those MPs were able to rationalise the debate in terms of their own beliefs.
The great thing about the debate was that it was incredibly respectful. No matter which side of the debate you were on, everybody listened with care and attention to what was being said. And obviously many people of faith were influenced by their faith. But that was why this was made a vote of conscience. It was not a whipped vote. It was not one that, and quite rightly, it should not be something that you say, oh, well, we have a manifesto commitment on something as deeply important to one's own sense of who one is, because this is one of the most deep ethical questions that one can have, and it was right that it was a free vote. So I think religion did not actually ostensibly play a part in the debate. People weren't saying this is prohibited by God. but obviously their own sense of where they stood in the debate probably was. But they then had to construct their arguments in a way that appealed to the wider audience who may not have shared their religious beliefs.
Supporters of the bill, such as MP Kim Leadbeater, point to the safeguards they tried to build in, such as 2 doctors, a judge, 6 months of life expectancy, and heavy jail sentences for those who might ill-advise or coerce someone into assisted dying. So you had talked about wanting another level of assurance. What would that be?
I think there was a recognition, not just from myself, but from others, that there needed to be additional safeguards. For example, the situation of the judge signing it off, that is really a technical formality. It's not there's no investigative powers that the judge has. He simply has to check whether 2 doctors have agreed. I'm afraid that my view on the way in which the medical profession might operate in this is that it is not even doctors who spoke in the debate accepted that 6 months was a very movable feast. Sometimes they give a prognosis, and that prognosis is entirely wrong. I think there was a concern that we would develop into 2 sets of doctors, those who were known to favor assisted dying and those who were not. And if you wanted that, you simply went to the ones who would sign you off without too much questioning. And I think that is, it was a safeguard, but I don't think it was an adequate safeguard.
Well, Mr. Gardner, the House of Commons is often known as a bit of a bullpit with impolite yelling and jeering, whereas many people describe this debate as very respectful and deeply moving. It seems to be quite a contrast from the usual scenes.
Yes, it really was, and goodness knows, I wish many more debates were conducted in that tone. I have to tell you, I think what made it very evident was there was one member of Parliament who entirely misjudged the mood of Parliament. I won't name who it was, but he sought to make a political point in his contribution. He sought to make a political point about the government's recent announcement of winter fuel payments and the taking away of the winter fuel payments for people who were not on the lowest band of benefit. And the whole House groaned. It was a gut groan. It was and it seemed that all of Parliament, whichever side you were on, were saying, what are you doing? You're trying to turn this into a political debate. It's not. It's bigger than that, and we have to be bigger than that. And in that sense, I really think Parliament showed itself at its best because it was respectful. It was a debate which was characterized by listening and trying to respond seriously to the points that each other were making.
Yes, as you say, many people did describe this as parliamentary debate at its best. And I wonder what lessons could be learned from this, especially at a time when people around the world are starting to lose faith in politics.
Yes. Well, the obvious thing is let's have more free votes. Let's have more conscience votes. And perhaps MPs, instead of feeling that they have to troop through the lobbies after their whips, will think more deeply about the consequences of the legislation that they're passing. So I wouldn't like people to get the impression that the Commons is all, shallow and point scoring. It's not. But certainly this debate, I think, did the House proud. And even though I was on the losing side, I recognize that probably the majority of the British population, certainly in the polling that's been taken, were on the side of the bill. They wanted to see the bill go forward. And in that way, I have to respect democracy and hope that I'm wrong and that the the fears that I have for this bill will not come to pass.
Sir, I understand that your parents died, sadly, while you were still very young. And I wonder if you believe that palliative care has sufficiently improved since then to be a viable alternative to the thought of assisted dying.
Look, I think everybody in that debate was clear that we need to improve palliative care in this country. Palliative care can be wonderful, and I've seen some marvelous examples in my own constituency and in my own personal life. My own father, as you mentioned, he died of esophageal cancer, which is a really ghastly way to die. And so I think we all understand that we need better palliative care. But I don't want to make the mistake of thinking that palliative care can alleviate everything. People in hospices do wonderful jobs, absolutely wonderful jobs. But I do understand why there are some situations for some people where assisted death does seem the only viable option. And that obviously is what the majority of members of the House of Commons felt.
Well, this moment has been compared with other parliamentary debates on sensitive matters such as same-sex marriage, abortion, the repeal of the death penalty. And I wonder how it sits alongside debates that Parliament has to conduct on economic and social and defence matters.
Oh, gosh. It's a very different thing. And that is why I think it has to be a vote of conscience, where every member of Parliament has the freedom to examine themselves, examine who they are, and examine who they feel the country ought to be, and to do the best for everybody in society. I often think of the writings of John Stuart Mill, the great libertarian Enlightenment philosopher of the 19th century. And he said a very strange thing, or people thought it was very strange. He said the reason that he was against the universal suffrage, the universal vote, was he believed that if everybody had the vote, then, and in those days it was only men, he said, men would come to regard the vote as an expression of their own private preference rather than as an expression of their public responsibility. Now, I think I disagree with his premise, because I think people always did use the vote as an expression of their own private preference. But it's a really fundamental principle that I think legislators need to always keep in mind. They're not legislating for what they would like. They're not legislating for what they think would benefit them or their particular group of people, or any particular group of people. They're there to legislate for the whole of society. And I think if we lose sight of that, then we lose really something that's very fundamental to our democracy. So these debates are very different. The debates you mentioned, ethical debates about the nature of life, the way in which our society regards life, when it begins, when it should end, how it should be conducted. Fundamental questions, very different from the education budget, very different from the issues of work and pensions and employment and industry, which we're doing all the time. But when you get that many serious people in a room taking the issue seriously, one has to hope that we arrive at a conclusion which does fit with our society and which does ultimately benefit the whole of our community.
Barry Gardiner, thank you very much for taking the time to give us your perspective on this debate. Thank you, sir.
Great pleasure. Thank you.
Barry Gardiner ended our conversation by describing how he finds philosophy to be a helpful resource when considering decisions on important issues, including matters of life and death. Meanwhile, 4,000 miles, about 6,000 kilometres from London, a global gathering of philosophers took place in Saudi Arabia. Quality of life was the main theme of the Riyadh International Philosophy Conference, featuring a diverse group of prominent thinkers. I was keen to hear their thoughts on the issues that were being debated in Britain. Dr. Joseph Cohen, I'm very happy to have a chance to chat with you. What's interesting is we're here at a philosophy conference in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia looking at something called quality of life. When it comes to quality of life, where does the whole concept of assisted dying fit in?
Excellent question. First of all, thank you very much. Assisted dying. A very famous, important philosopher, Martin Heidegger, wrote in Being and Time, 1927, wrote that no one can take dying away from the person. No one can take someone's dying away from him or her.
A right to die.
That is, the experience of dying is always unsubstitutable. It cannot be taken away from anyone. My dying will be my own dying. Your dying will be your own dying, and no one will be able to take that away from you or I. So the experience of dying is a singular experience, right? The right to die is the right to live through that experience. That is, the right to confront the experience of dying. I believe that this confrontation is a confrontation of human existence. Human existence needs to confront this dying, because in this confrontation, it shows the possibility for the subject to project himself or herself into life.
But what's happened, Dr. Cohen, is that it's all become a legal matter now.
Right.
Not a philosophical one.
Right.
And that's where the complications come in. Who has the right to be involved, whether it's family members, friends, whatever? What right does the person who wants to die have? It's a very sensitive topic, and I can understand it because it brings in ethics, religion, and everything else. But when it comes to the idea of this debate, what should be the angles we as a society, global society, should look at?
I think we should definitely entertain the possibility of respecting human finitude. I think one of the major challenges of our time is to confront the finitude of our human existence. And in a certain manner, I think a lot of the problems of our epoch are linked to the idea that we can think beyond human finitude. We can think ourselves as almost infinite. I think we need to refocus on the possibility for human rationality to truly look at what the meaning of life is, what the quality of life is, in the horizon of finitude. And in this sense, death, although it is the absolute master, to speak like Hegel, for example, the German philosopher, death is the absolute master. Death may not be that which is a radical interruption of humanity. On the contrary, it may precisely be the revelator of that which projects humanity. You see?
I guess the argument is death may be inevitable for all of us, but who should have a choice on when that event occurs?
But you see, even that question, although I understand why we're posing it, even that question is impossible to answer. Death is impossible to determine. Death is one's own, and yet at the same time, it's not one's own. I will be given my death, even if it's my own. You will be given your death, and it will only be yours, but it's not yours to have.
Let's pretend you're a lawyer defending someone who went through assisted dying.
Yeah.
How are you going to explain all this in court?
Yeah, it's obvious that the way I'm seeking to think the problem of dying is far removed from the idea of law, from the legal apparatus. Because I make a very sharp distinction between the law and justice. perhaps being just towards death, towards the question of death, involves or engages our thinking beyond the law. That is, outside the sphere of law.
I think the UK, which is debating this right now, is in a very difficult position because, of course, it's combining religion, philosophy, ethics, and legality. If it's not too personal a question, would you opt for assisted dying?
Very, very complex question. Myself, and speaking strictly for myself, yes, I would. I think that confronting the question of death, confronting one's dying, is the most radical human experience. And in a certain manner, the courage it takes to confront that experience needs to be given to human finitude, needs to be allowed for in human experience. So yes, I would certainly give each and every one of us, as human existence, as existing humans, the possibility to confront this experience of dying.
And yet, it's seen as a sin in so many societies.
Yes.
How do we rationalize that?
Well, I think, yeah, it definitely is seen as a sin, but I think we can understand a certain manner of thinking the religious, even the ethical, in relation to human experience, which would also involve the idea of confronting the experience of dying.
Professor Robert Bernasconi, really it's a pleasure to be sitting here with you. And I'm going to start by asking you about the debate that's going on in the UK right now regarding assisted dying. The reason being is that raises so many issues. And again, from a philosophical perspective, there's the ethics, there's religion, there's legality. What's your take on what's happening?
That's a very difficult question. I personally, I'm not attached to life. And I'd be perfectly happy to die right now. I mean, you'd probably like me to finish the interview.
Last 20 minutes.
Yes, I'll do my best. But so, for me, life is a wonderful thing. And yet, I don't have that sense. I have a sense of responsibility that I'm taking up space, I'm doing so and so forth. Now, I entirely understand all the back and forth about the issues, that people could be pressurized to take death rather than continue when they don't want to. And that sounds like a horrible thing. But I also understand people who are in pain. So it's just a question of trying to find arrangements so that people can be confident in the system.
I can say honestly, in 10,000 plus interviews over the years, I've never had anyone say they could be happy to die right now. I mean, I've heard people say they're not scared of death. Mm-hmm. They're not worried about, death. It's an inevitability. But I'm just baffled. Sorry, I'm going to delve into this a bit, but just ask, where does this detachment from life come?
Well, I've just had a wonderful life. I mean,
there's a lot more,
blessed.
Hopefully, isn't there?
Well, I'm 74 years old, so not that much more.
74 is young.
Yeah, to some people. I mean, no doubt if I do live to 94, I'll think about when I was 74 and think, oh, I was young back in those days. But no, I'm perfectly happy with the idea that I've had a great life. I think I've done some good things and some bad things, and I just don't want to ruin it. Aristotle says, you can only tell whether a person was happy, had eudaimonia is his word, after they're dead. And right now, I think I would be on the plus side. But maybe I'll go off and do something wrong and wish I died before this interview if I say the wrong thing today.
Professor Fausto Frisopi, thank you so much for spending some time with us. The big debate currently in society, certainly in the UK, is this concept of assisted dying. And what that does is it raises a lot of questions about what ethics are. From a philosopher's perspective, how do we set ethical boundaries?
So the problem is, in my view,
don't fall in eugenetics. We already known from many decades ago. The problem is assisting dying is voluntarily or willingly asked from the patient. Why not? There is no ethic boundaries. But the ethic boundary will be strong or too strong when the society decide when is the case or not. And precisely where the point on which philosophy have something to say is if there is the case or not. It's not a matter of taxonomy if there is if it's the case or not, but a matter of general conception of life and when a life is worthy to live to the end, even with sickness, even with handicaps, and so on and so on. In my view, the extreme boundary and the extreme danger is the eugenetics. When a society settle taxonomies to say, okay, we can intervene for assisting that.
Let me get on to what has been the subject of this philosophy conference, quality of life, because that's actually the precursor to this debate.
Yes.
And I guess it comes down to how we judge quality of life. Now, there's obviously medical illness and serious conditions that warrant a different level of discussion. There's quality of life in terms of what people perceive as wealth or, capability, financial capability. What is quality of life in your terms?
There's a very sharp distinction in the history of philosophy between quantity and quality. Quantity, we all know, quantity is opulence, a mass of goods, and quality is something quite different. I think quality is the capacity to reveal what is singular in life, what is non-negotiable in life, what is radically singular and particular. Now, I believe that each and every one of us must think that problem of singularity through, must think the relationship between what is singular and what is qualitative. Now, if you ask me as a philosopher, I will tell you that what is most important in this qualitative ideal is time, temporality, how to use our time, how to think through the utilization of our time, of our temporality, as existence, but also our time with others, our time that we share with others in our communities, in our families, even in regards to our country, etc.
My mother, as a personal note, my mother went through years of Parkinson's disease, and at one point she said to me, as she was losing her physical capabilities, her mind was still sharp, she said, "This is not living, it's existence." That resonated with me. So how do we determine what a person is entitled to in terms of quality of life?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because you're marking the distinction between life and existence. Now, perhaps I should make something quite obvious. Existence, the word existence, means actually to step out of oneself, transcend oneself. It comes from the existence, it means to come out of oneself. I'm very attached to this idea. I'm very attached to this idea because I believe that human life must constantly and incessantly transcend itself. One must transcend itself, out of itself, into a betterment of oneself, into the qualitative ideal of a temporality that stretches out. The main problem for me when I think about the idea of quality of life is that we often reduce temporality. We often reduce temporality to a particular goal. I want such and such a thing. I want to achieve such and such a job. I want to achieve such and such a situation. We restrict temporality to succeeding in a particular goal or a particular appropriation of a goal. I would rather and remaining faithful to this idea of existing, I would like us to think quality of life as stretching out time.
This leads me almost perfectly onto where society has gone in terms of quality of life. I mean, many people, myself sometimes also, bemoan the fact that we've become so short-term in our thinking. We have lost, as society, our understanding of the difference between need and want.
Yes.
And it's driven very much by want, so much more than need. And that kind of detaches us from the real needs on this planet, between societies and cultures and so on. So when we think of quality of life in those terms, how can we bring ourselves back to understanding these differences? When you have a conference looking at the quality of life, how do you get people to consider this and not think short term and materialistically?
Yeah, no, I think I mean you're putting your finger on a very important topic, and I think a topic that will be discussed throughout our conference. That is, how can we instill in our lives, in the quality of our lives, the possibility to invent or to think outside the box, to be very pragmatic in my speech. That is, think outside the box, invent outside the determined modalities of our thinking. You were asking me about where has society gone. I feel today, politically, sociologically, anthropologically, even geographically, I feel that we have reached a point where our humanity is extremely determined in the simple repetition of inherited ideas. I believe what we need is to reinvent these inherited ideas.
But what are these inherited ideas based on?
They're based on a tradition, and I'm all for the enhancement of our tradition, but I'm also thinking that our humanity, and this is why I'm so attached to this project here in Riyadh, is that we are incessantly seeking to reinvent our tradition. That is, take our tradition and our different traditions. It's an international conference. People from all walks of life, not only philosophers, scientists, not only people from the Middle East, but also people from all over the world are coming to Riyadh to take what our traditions have given us and invent a commonality of humanity. And this is what I feel and fear we have lost in many of our societies, the power to invent and reinvent what we receive.
The conference, the Riyadh International Philosophy Conference, the theme for this year has been quality of life. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, where this fits into what you might define as quality of life.
Well, in my talk, I talked about how the quality of life has become the slogan in well-being league tables put out by the World Health Organization and other similar organizations. And I just feel that they have entirely missed the point, that too easily this becomes an instrument for governments to be competing against each other, to be higher up in the league table. They're more likely to go higher up in the league table if they're keeping the middle class happy rather than addressing poverty or systemic issues like climate change. And so I just think that the whole emphasis is wrong. And so in my talk, I was talking about poverty and hunger and why I would prefer to see that as the issue, and global poverty. It shouldn't be countries competing against each other to be better than the other one. We should be trying to pull up the people who need the most help.
So when it comes to the term quality of life, what's your definition of it?
Oh, I don't have a definition. I'm not that kind of philosopher, thankfully. So I just think the phrase, which basically, not many people know this, but it gained currency because President Lyndon Johnson used it in a talk he gave in Madison Gardens.
Yeah.
Thank you, yes, in 1964. And then all these economists went off and thought, oh, that's what we should be talking about, not GDP, but quality of life. And so that's why they tried to measure it and so on. But I think that, again, it's always going to be different for different people and different cultures. And I think trying to make this a competition is a mistake.
Do you find the world of philosophy is a shrinking one?
Oh, that's a very provocative, in its own sense, it's a very provocative question. At times, I do feel philosophy is shrinking. That is, I do feel philosophy is becoming ever more so specialized and structured only on the repetition of its own tradition, which is an extremely rich tradition. And certainly we need that form of specialization in universities and research centers. And I'm a professional philosopher, so I'm not going to criticize that. But at the same time, I do feel that what philosophy really needs and how philosophy can really help, because we always say philosophy cannot help our society, they're abstract and they're living in their ivory towers in Cambridge and Oxford or wherever, but where philosophy can really truly help is to develop and deploy in what is common, what is to reveal in what is common, what is singular. That is, from where we can reinvent ourselves. I think philosophy has a task today to insist on the reinvention of our humankind.
Is the problem that philosophy is considered elite? Is that the issue?
No, it's one of the problems. It's one of the problems, and I think philosophy has a great responsibility in that elite manner of appearing, and I think philosophy must, in a way, come down from that elite status and become much closer to our everyday life. But at the same time, I would never want philosophy to let go of its radicality, and its radicality is what? Its radicality is, again, the possibility for the subject to transcend itself, for the human subject to transcend itself, to become other than itself, to reinvent itself.
Do you, as a philosopher, often change your ideas, your philosophies?
Constantly. And I think, if I may be a little bit provocative even about philosophy, I think one of the great dangers of philosophy and of philosophy as a discipline is to always pretend that coherence is the sole motivator for human beings. I think there is a value to uncoherence, of the possibility of constantly and incessantly changing to adapt to our singular existential situations. The situation of 1968 is not the same situation in 2024. We need to have not only evolved from 68 to 2024, but rethink the very concepts that were used in 68, rethink those concepts for 2024. That means constantly and incessantly change.
Do you think there has been a change in this global society that's now being created by the internet, the World Wide Web, interconnectivity at a global level? Is there a change in philosophy? Is there a better exchange of understanding of ideas?
Yeah, I would say the culture interact when there is, at first and foremost, commercial exchange. So the beginning of the Renaissance, the rise of Columbus, then the rise of the companies to the east, the Jesuit company already increased the knowledge from the west to the east, and so on and so on. Now we live in a globalized world. This is my matter of study, in a complex world. And in this case, of course, technologies can help to a dialogue. But I will say, as a platform, not as a form of dialogue. The dialogue must be established person to person in such conferences, in long dialogues, not with smart messages and all what the platforms provide to us.
Thinking of different cultures, is philosophy as a subject, is it universal, or is it very much divided along cultural lines and, I guess religious lines, ethnic lines?
Well, obviously there's been a huge variety of philosophies, and I'm not a mainstream philosopher. I've done quite well, I got a job, but I'm not one of those people who is trying to conform to whatever the fashion is. So quite honestly, I think a lot of current philosophy is not very interesting. I think it's geared towards an academic audience. It doesn't know how to get beyond that. It's geared towards trying to publish as many articles as possible. So I think philosophy has lost its way. And one of the luxuries of having a job with tenure is that I can do what I want.
What would be your version of what philosophy should be then?
I think it should be trying to hear voices from more different people. And that's why I think that to a certain extent, what we call Western philosophy is somewhat played out, at least in terms of what it's become. I'm not denying the wonderful classics that I enjoy studying. So I'm not one of these people against the great books, as it were. But I do think that if we could hear more from people from India, from Saudi Arabia, from Algeria, wherever, I just think that that is what will refresh and renew philosophy, because it's coming from different conditions, different contexts, people have different intuitions depending on where they're brought up.
Well, my intention would be to speak with you a lot longer, but I'm going to ask you a final question as we are running out of time. And that would be, is philosophy as a concept, as a source of inspiration and kind of debate in society, is it dying?
I want to make a very firm distinction here. I think if I look at academic philosophy as it's practiced in many elite institutions, I would say it deserves to die. If you look at the issues that ordinary people have that we need to introduce or reintroduce back into philosophy, then it'll never die.
Professor Robert Bernasconi, what a pleasure. Thank you, sir.
I enjoyed it too.
Thank you. Professor Versopi, thank you so much for joining me on the show.
Thank you too.
Thank you, sir. Well, Dr. Joseph Cohen, what a pleasure. You've provoked a lot of thought here, I hope, with the people watching. Certainly have with me. Real pleasure. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Some thoughts there on how the ancient tradition of philosophy can be applied to very current issues that are being passionately debated in some parts of the world today. Thanks to all my guests for their respectful, considered and sensitive contributions they brought to this episode. I'm Riz Khan from me and the team. Thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday here on Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson, and as the end of the year approaches, we thought we'd prepare this special edition with some highlights from the last week. We can speak now to Hagar Shamali, who is a former National Security Council Director for Lebanon and Syria under the administration of President Barack Obama, who joins us now from New York. Hagar, great to have you with us on the programme. Clearly, you've been monitoring these developments in Syria, in particular the last few weeks. I mean, what are your thoughts on what's happened there?
Well, it's just stunning. You know, when I was director for Syria and Lebanon at the White House, and that was during the first 2 years of the Syria crisis, we used to say that it was not a matter of if, but when Bashar al-Assad would fall. Clearly, we didn't anticipate that it would happen 13 years later. But, you know, I was overjoyed to see him run like a coward to Moscow. And though I am concerned, of course, of the potential for risks and instability in Syria, but my first two thoughts were just the incredible shift in geopolitical dynamics, because this wouldn't have happened had you not had the weakening of Assad's, what I like to call, club of baddies. You have Iran, that has been on the defense, it's been humiliated by Israel, and is literally on the defense since Israel struck its defense capabilities. You have Hezbollah, that's been decapitated and decimated. Hamas, which is on its own, is practically eradicated. And then you have Russia, which has spent its resources, is relying on North Korea to help in its war in Ukraine, which is what's consuming Russia right now. And these are the players that propped Assad up, notably Russia in 2014, is really what shifted the tides in favor of Assad back during the civil war. So given that weakening, and also given the fact that Assad, since the ceasefire in 2020 between Assad and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, because nothing had happened since then, Assad did absolutely nothing to placate his constituents, to support them for the reasons for which they had been protesting to begin with. On the contrary, he turned Syria into a narco state. His own military didn't want to support him and were scared. And no dictator can stand without their military. And that's a rule in our history. And so when the military defected this way, that's also what allowed these rebels to so swiftly take Damascus. It was absolutely stunning, and certainly not on anybody's 2024 bingo card.
Yeah, indeed, a very surprising and rapid turn of events. And I just want to ask you, I mean, we've heard a lot of diplomats have been descending on Damascus the last couple of days. The US obviously sounding cautious, like lots of countries, with regards to the new leadership in Damascus. I mean, do you think the US is playing its cards right as things stand?
Well, yes, to put it simply, because they have to be cautious. And you base it in fact. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, you just have to look at their history. And I'm talking about recent history. If you look at their older history, they were an offshoot of Al-Qaeda. When I was in the US government and we sanctioned Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, it was because it was Al-Qaeda's branch in Syria. And since then, as we know publicly, Ahmed al-Shara, his nom de guerre was Mohammed al-Julani. He had disavowed global terrorism. He cut ties with Al-Qaeda and rebranded the group as a group focused on Syria's independence and liberation, and then adopted this new name. The original name was the Al-Nusra Front. But the United States is not the only one that sanctioned this group, and it's not only the UK either, but the United Nations did as well, which means that all UN member states technically sanctioned this group. And so that's the history. But if you just look at recently, as September 2024, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham was repressing protesters with excessive force in the northwest of Syria and Idlib, in the area that it was controlling. It also was arbitrarily detaining people. There's a British aid worker who said that he was tortured while he was detained. Islamists in the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham militia assassinated famous, well-known human rights activist in Syria, Raed Faris. So this is their track record. And so we have to be very careful, given that this is a group that, when it was governing the corner of northwest Syria up until 2 weeks ago, was governing with repression, with an extreme Sunni Islamist ideology. You have to imagine that is what they might, that might be their agenda, although Mohammed al-Julani or Ahmed al-Shara is saying all the right things, and he is saying all the right things. But the US has to maintain some of those sanctions as leverage to make sure that his actions are backed up with the words that he's giving, that he walks the walk and not talks the talk only.
And Hagar, just to clarify with you, when you're talking about sanctions, I mean, obviously Syria is currently held back by two separate sets of sanctions, those targeting the regime of Bashar al-Assad, which is now gone, and of course HTS is on this list of designated terror organizations. I mean, is the United States likely to remove either of those two designations, both of which could be viewed as holding Syria back?
Right. The sanctions related to the Assad regime are more likely to be considered for withdrawal in the near term. And I imagine the U.S. diplomats who are going to Damascus, who are engaging with European allies, with HTS as well, are trying to figure out what sanctions could be removed that would no longer pose any kind of threat, because those sanctions to begin with were placed to prevent Assad from raising, moving, and storing funds so that he couldn't finance his war machine and that he couldn't use his power and abuse it for the benefit of himself and his own family. And so those sanctions, a lot of them can be removed. I don't think anything related to him personally would be removed, but he's in Moscow anyway. But things like, for example, the Central Bank of Syria, that was sanctioned when I was at the White House, and because it was viewed as a key element that was propping up the Assad's war machine. But if we're trying to pursue humanitarian aid now and get the economy going, those are sanctions that could be considered for withdrawal. When it comes to sanctions regarding Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, this is much more difficult, because usually when sanctions are imposed, you stipulate the reasons for which they were sanctioned, and it's under U.S. law. And so we cannot, for political reasons, just remove a sanction or for reasons to hope. They have to prove that they're no longer engaged in the activity for which they were sanctioned. And like I said, for Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in particular, the U.S. might use that as a piece of leverage to say, well, listen, you've given all these promises. You've promised to protect minorities. You've promised to hold fair elections. We're going to hold that in place just in case, until we see that you've achieved these number of steps or promises, and then we'll release those sanctions at the end of that. But they're not going to do it at the beginning.
Okay, and obviously Syria in a stage of a phase of transition through to March with this transitional leadership. The United States also in something of a transitional phase as well, with a new leadership due to take office in just a few weeks from now. Are you expecting to see a big change in US approach, do you think, between the Biden administration and that of the incoming President-elect Donald Trump?
To be frank with you, I don't expect that big of a change between the two, because neither of them really prioritized Syria back when Trump was in office during his first term, and neither did President Biden now in the last 4 years. And when everything was unfolding in Syria, President-elect Trump put out a tweet right away, a post saying, I hope that the U.S. doesn't get involved. This is not something that they should be involved in. And to be honest with you, from the beginning, when I handled, as I mentioned, the first 2 years of the Syria crisis, and the U.S. was accused of, quote, leading from behind, not an expression the American officials liked. But the fact is that the U.S. did not get heavily involved in Syria. We didn't threaten military intervention, for example, in response to Bashar al-Assad's atrocities. And that's left a sour taste, if you will, for Syrians, for many, many Syrians who feel very deceived, if you will, by the U.S. and the Europeans and the international community in general. So we have to tread very carefully. And while Syria does pose a great national security, there are many national security objectives for the United States. It's surrounded by U.S. allies. We don't want to see spillover of any kind of instability or rebels gone wild or terrorist groups proliferating. And we don't want to see them going into Lebanon or Jordan. We don't want to see them posing a threat to Israel, toward Iraq, or certainly to Turkey. And so Syria is important. And Syria used to be the land bridge between Iran and Hezbollah, and now it won't be any more likely. And that's an exciting opportunity. And so there is an interest in ensuring that things don't devolve into chaos in Syria, but without a heavy hand. It has to be somewhat light in a supportive role, given the last 8 to 10 years. But again, I don't expect a significant difference. I do expect the focus to be on maintaining we have a U.S. presence of just under 1,000 troops in the northeast of Syria. They are there to support the Kurds in preventing the reemergence of ISIS. President-elect Trump didn't really understand that the first term, but I do believe he understands why that troop presence is important now, and I expect them to maintain that, because preventing the reemergence of ISIS is critical, and certainly fighting for the release of American journalist Austin Tice, who's been detained in Syria since 2012 and who is believed to be alive.
I mean, we were talking just before we crossed you about the countries that have gone to Damascus to establish, the early stages of a diplomatic presence after a very long absence in some cases. Which country's presence and which country's involvement at this stage would you say is most important to the success or the failure of this new administration in Damascus?
It's a great question. To be, it really, you have to have the Middle Eastern countries, particularly the Gulf in particular. There is a shift, and this is what I meant earlier when we were talking about the geopolitical dynamics. It's the so-called axis of resistance is crumbling, if not crumbled. And that really shifts things in the Middle East if you look at the region alone. And it shifts things away from the axis of resistance toward an agenda that is more pro-international, frankly, wants to play by the rules, wants to be part of the international community. And so I expect especially in the Gulf in particular, which has a much stronger economy, has a system of governance that they can share, and also that they had already established certain relationships. Now, this is the most important. At the same time, while I agree, and I mentioned earlier that the U.S. and Europe, their influence is weaker because they didn't play a heavy hand over the last 12, 13 years. However, you don't want at the same time a country like Turkey that is trying to play a very heavy role. They have already invaded the north of Syria quite significantly. We don't want Turkey to play that hand in their favor. We don't want a country like Russia or China swooping in and trying to push things in their favor. Russia's probably more on the defense at this point, but still. For that reason, it's also you also really want the U.S. and European influence and other countries that do have Syria's best interest at heart, that civilians are protected, that things are stable, that they remain stable, that for areas of Syria that are currently not under any control, that they don't devolve into chaos, that other rebel groups with other agendas don't seek to take advantage of that. It will be difficult, though. I don't want to make it seem like pursuing a stable transition to democracy is going to be easy, as excited as I am for the Syrian people, because they've never been closer to freedom. However, history has proven to us that when you have an Islamist militia take control, they make many promises, and often they discover that in order to stay in control, they end up pursuing repressive tactics. And so dangling those carrots of, hey, we could remove sanctions, and hey, you could be part of the international financial system if you actually transition and you say what you're going to do. They could be very valuable, but it does take players all over the world.
Okay, and obviously lots of countries want to get involved in what's happening in Syria. It's a strategically incredibly important country with lots of borders. Doesn't sound like you think, perhaps, and talking to other people on this program, doesn't sound like many people think Russia and Iran are going to be too much involved in the next few months, at any rate, not in the medium term. But with regards to Turkey, some people really crediting President Recep Tayyip Erdogan with having played his hand masterfully with regards to the situation there, and really emerging there as a major global player. I mean, do you agree that he's been skillful in terms of how he's managed his country's relationship with Syria, and how things are going to unfold there?
Well, I'm loath to ever really say that the Turkish president is Erdogan is playing his hand skillfully, because I don't trust his agenda. And I don't believe that he's governed his own country very well at all, whether it's regarding repression or the economy. And even from my own experience in government, I always found that his interest was to be some kind of regional hegemon. And frankly, much of the Middle East rejects that. They didn't like it the first 400 years of the Ottoman Empire. They certainly don't like it now. And so while you could argue that he's played it somewhat masterfully in that he has chosen a winning side, at the same time, that doesn't necessarily mean it may work for international relations. It may work in terms of future investment, but I don't believe it's going to work in terms of pushing strong influence across the entire country, because there is a lot of distrust, and that is across the Levant and across the region. There's a lot of distrust of President Erdogan. And so, and again, there's going to be an inevitable balance of power. I don't think Erdogan is going to really be able to play this too much. And And he has an interest as well in pushing back and confronting the Kurds, for example, which is likely why they have invaded that northern part of Syria. So played his hand well, sure, we could say that for this time period, but I'd be loath to say that that it's going to end up being this big win or huge win that Erdogan likely envisions.
I know Lebanon is a country very close to your heart, and it was close to your portfolio under President Barack Obama. I mean, obviously, Lebanon has itself been through considerable upheaval the last few months and years, in fact. How closely intertwined would you say the fortunes of Syria and Lebanon are moving forward?
Yes, you know, the dominoes that will continue to fall because of Assad's collapse will be stunning. And so one of the things, as I mentioned, is that you've got the fact that Syria can no longer be this land bridge between Iran and Hezbollah. And so given that Hezbollah has already had its arsenal significantly hit, its leadership and commanders mostly killed off, the fact that it's lost its ability to even be able to resupply following the ceasefire that you've had now between Lebanon and Israel. That is huge. And the reason that's huge is because Hezbollah is the one that's been holding Lebanon hostage for decades now. And with every year that passed, they were only getting stronger and stronger, preventing a president from taking office, turning the country into a narco state, using all of its resources to further its criminal goals, whether it was using the airport and ports to pursue money laundering and other nefarious behavior. It's Hezbollah has been the cancer that has been eating away at Lebanon. And so not only, and it's exciting because not only has it been decimated by Israel significantly in a way that none of us foresaw this year, but now it doesn't even have a chance to resupply itself. So it's on its back heels. And that will allow Lebanon, if the Lebanese leaders can really unite, and that's a tough one in Lebanon, but if they can really unite, if you have the Speaker of the House, Nabi Berri, and you have the Prime Minister, Miati, and you have, and they agree to have elections to hold a president finally, and then they unite with the goal of actually installing in Lebanon a system that is much more cleaner, much more fair, focused on actually improving its economy. Now, again, I feel like I'm shooting for the stars here, but at least this time it feels like they have a chance, whereas Hezbollah was really holding them back. And that's what I'm most excited about to see in Lebanon.
Yeah, I mean, just wrapping up because we're out of time, but Hagar, you sound pretty optimistic just listening to what you were saying there.
Do I sound optimistic? I think I would say that is the Middle East going to be safer this year? And I would say yes and no. You're going to see, because of these shifts in geopolitical dynamics, certain things work out for the better. For example, like I mentioned in Lebanon, in Syria, I'm worried. I am happy that Bashar al-Assad is gone. I don't want to pretend like I'm not, but I am very worried because it's very tenuous. So we're going to see, I think, in 2025, certainly a mix of some good things and perhaps some concerning things as well.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. Hagar Shamali, thanks again.
Thank you.
Turning our attention now to the United States, where there's just over 1 month to go until the inauguration of President-elect Donald Trump. Well, a subject of considerable discussion on both sides of the aisle there in the US has been the cabinet appointments that will be central to the incoming Trump administration. Well, amongst the picks, Sebastian Gorka, the president-elect's nomination for Director of Counterterrorism, who served briefly in the first Trump administration. He'll be taking up that new role at a time of uncertainty in several areas of the world, including in the Middle East and in Ukraine, and at a time when some say the US is more divided than ever before. Well, Dr. Gorka joins us now from Washington. Thank you so much for speaking to us. You've been nominated, as I said, as Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Counterterrorism. Congratulations on that. Just tell us, how did this appointment come about? Did Mr. Trump call you himself?
Well, let me just first say that it's not quite cabinet level. Thank you kindly. Usually that's for secretaries. But yes, I will be in the White House running counterterrorism for the president and for the incoming National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz. How did it come about? About a year and a half before the election, I traveled to Mar-a-Lago to talk to President Trump about what I could do to support him and the America First agenda, should we be so lucky to have him reelected. And then, yes, about half an hour before the announcement was officially made, he called me from Mar-a-Lago and he said, Sebastian, get ready. It's about to become official.
Okay, so it didn't come as a complete surprise, I take it.
No, not completely. Not completely. He said he wanted me back for a second administration in that term. And then about a week or 10 days before the nomination was actually official, there was a gathering at Mar-a-Lago where he saw me in the crowd and he said in front of a few hundred people, we're going to give Seb a very special job. And somebody recorded it on the ubiquitous cell phone and uploaded it onto social media. So it wasn't quite as much of a surprise as even I had expected.
Okay, well, you are indeed, as we've been saying, taking up that senior role, Director for Counterterrorism. Just wondering what you're going to bring to the role.
About 30 years of doing this. So I've spent my career in national security studying the ideology and the strategy of global jihadist groups such as Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, Hezbollah, Hamas. I've trained the US military, law enforcement, the intelligence community. So now it's going beyond the theory and the training aspect to the actual policy coordination for the US government in counterterrorism.
Just to be clear, I mean, on a formality, this is a role that doesn't require Senate confirmation, does it? So there are no hoops for you to jump through, so to speak.
Well, only the internal ones. Everybody who works for the president has to be vetted both politically and in terms of security clearance. I have maintained my top secret security clearance since I left government, so that's even less of a hurdle for me. But no, everyone who works inside the White House, who works inside the National Security Council as a political appointee of the president does not require Senate confirmation.
Okay, we've been talking a lot on this channel, Al Arabiya News, about the new lineup in the Trump administration, who's in, who's not in. Just wondering what your thoughts are as to when you look at that lineup, what's going to be achieved when Donald Trump gets back to the White House?
Everything will be achieved that is required to make all Americans prosperous and safe, whether or not they voted for President Trump, whether or not they're amongst the 77 million who said, yes, after the disastrous Biden-Harris 4 years, we want President Trump back. If you look at the picks, they're all people who have proven themselves, people who know each other. I mean, it's not a secret. You know, I'm friends with Kash Patel, the incoming director of the FBI. Likewise, Tom Homan, the real border czar who is coming in to work for President Trump to replace that disaster who was Kamala Harris's putative border czar. So this is a group of people who understand President Trump, understand the mandate of 77 million votes, popular and electoral college. And these are people who are committed to one thing and the one thing above all else: America first and making America great again. That's the big difference, on top of the fact that we will not permit seditionist, traitorous individuals into the building, like former Chief of Staff John Kelly, like Colonel Vindman, who actually committed felonies by leaking classified information to the mainstream media to undermine and sabotage the president. That will not be happening in the second Trump administration.
What do you think are going to be your top priorities, your top concerns as you take up that position? And I'm talking here specifically with regards to counterterrorism efforts.
Well, you can split the terrorist threat into two very obvious baskets: the intrinsic, the internal, and the extrinsic, the external. So what we have inside America, continental United States, is an unbelievably heightened terrorist threat thanks to the feckless lack of leadership of the Biden-Harris administration. They literally dismantled our border, made sure we had no national sovereignty. As a result, the official Biden figures are that 8 million illegals were allowed into the country in the last 4 years. If you add to those the gotaways, people who were not in contact with the authorities as they crossed the border, you can double it to about 16 million at least. If only 1% of that 16 million are malefactors, are cartel members, foreign agents, terrorists, then we are talking about divisional-sized assets. So the primary concern, for Kash Patel, for Governor Noam, Secretary of Homeland Security, for Tom Homan as the borders are, is to identify the most dangerous terrorist threats who are inside America already, thanks to Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, and to neutralize them and to get them out of America. The external threat, sadly, is very simply the recrudescence of global jihadism. We saw what happened in October the 7th with the slaughter of the innocents in Israel. And now we see the collapse of Syria provide new opportunities for the global jihadi movement, even if they've tried to relabel themselves as moderates. Global jihadism is on the rise. Thanks to Joe Biden's lack of leadership, that will be our two primary baskets of terrorist threats.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you about events in Syria. Obviously, Bashar al-Assad is out after his family ruled the country for 54 years. HTS is in. Do you think the United States should reconsider that group's designation as a terrorist organization?
I'm not going to steal the thunder of my past and future boss, President Trump, nor Colonel Mike Waltz, the incoming National Security Advisor, or the Secretary of State. Foreign terrorist designations are done through the State Department. So, Senator Rubio will be heavily involved in any FTO designations. But let me tell you, as somebody who's studied jihadis for about 30 years, there has never, ever been a case since the establishment of the Ikhwan after Mustafa Kemal Ataturk dissolved the original caliphate after World War I. There has never been a modern jihadi leader who suddenly became a moderate after decapitating Christians and Jews and apostate Muslims or burning Jordanian fighter pilots alive in cages. None of these leaders said, "Oh no, I love Jews and Christians" the next day, or apostate Muslims who disagree with us, they're fine. Never happened in history, so let me just leave it at that. The idea that, a jihadi leader who was a part of ISIS slightly trims his beard and says, "I'm a good guy now," hasn't happened in the last 100 years of the modern global jihadi movement.
Indeed, but not all of that can be applied to Ahmed al-Shara, or also known as Mohammed al-Jalani, who promises to be representative and inclusive in.
Why can't it be applied to him?
You don't believe what he's been saying and the overtures he's been making?
People don't lie. Brutal jihadis don't lie. Is that what you're telling me? Or are you telling me you're looking into his soul and you know whether he's telling the truth or not?
I'm not saying I'm looking into his soul. I'm asking whether you believe him when he says he's going to form an inclusive leadership there in Damascus.
Well, I think I answered the question, didn't I? In the last 100 years of the modern global jihadi movement, from the Ikhwan to Al-Qaeda to Daesh, there has never been a jihadi leader who became a moderate just because he said so. So draw your requisite conclusions.
So the UN envoy has been in Damascus this week. Various European diplomats have been in Damascus this week. Some flags have been hoisted above embassies in Damascus this week. Do you think it's not better that there should be dialogue with this new leadership in Damascus than no dialogue at all?
You're kind of going around in circles, or I'm not sure you're listening to what I said. In the history, the 100-year history of the modern jihadi movement, since the establishment of the Muslim Brotherhood, there has never been a prominent jihadi leader who became a moderate. Never happened. So that's my take on what we're witnessing in Syria. And I don't speak for other US nations. I don't even speak for America. I'm a private citizen until 12:01 on January the 20th. And I'm not speaking for President Trump either. But the idea that the United Nations did something, you mean the organization that is predominantly famous for having its blue helmets rape children in Africa? Let me just say, I'm really not interested in what the United Nations may or may not be doing right now in terms of jihadism, because they don't have a very preeminent track record in that domain.
So your assessment of Syria's future, I mean, from what I'm hearing, doesn't sound very optimistic.
Well, it's completely fluid. It's an utterly plastic situation right now. I mean, God bless Israel for what they've done to secure their country after the biggest loss of Jewish life since the end of the show, at the end of the Holocaust in 1945. There are numerous actors in the region, whether it's the Kurds in the north, whether it's the Druze in the south, whether it's the Arab militias who are anti-jihadi. These are all actors involved in that region right now. If anybody tells you they know what the future of that benighted country is, they're lying to you. So I have one request for Christmas. I would like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and Jake Sullivan not to do anything in the region because they've created enough chaos and carnage in the last 4 years, and wait until the adults who actually know what they're doing are back in control at 12:01 on January the 20th.
Okay, so in your capacity as a private citizen, can I ask for your opinion? The $10 million bounty on the head of al-Jilani, should that be removed?
Not appropriate for me to comment, given my incoming position.
Okay. You mentioned your strong support for Israel. There are reports coming out of Cairo, quite promising sounding reports, that a ceasefire deal could be fairly imminent with regards to the continuing war in Gaza. I just wonder what you make of those reports.
What I said when I saw the unedited 47-minute video of what the jihadists of Hamas did on October the 7th. I want Israel to kill everybody responsible for the rape and murder of women and children and the killing of unarmed men on that day. We are in a civilizational war between decency and barbarity. On the one side, Judeo-Christian civilization and our Muslim allies and partners in the Middle East. And on the other side, those who believe that decapitating innocent journalists live on camera like Daniel Pearl because they're American and Jewish is okay. I am wearing a bracelet from the families of the hostages I met a week ago, some of whom are American citizens. And it says, bring them all home now. This is an absolute outrage that we are, a year and a half away from that atrocity, and we still have those in captivity, Jewish and American, who are being used as bargaining chips by individuals who have an ideology that negates the right of existence for a whole civilization and whole nations. That's where I stand. I stand with decency against barbarity.
And what would you say would be the best way to go about getting those remaining hostages home?
It's exactly what President Trump said, and it is what the families of those hostages told me. They have had more than 100 visits with the Biden administration since October the 7th, more than 100, to no avail. And they said to us, they said to me, the one social media post from President Trump a week and a half ago, where he said that if the hostages are not released by the time of his inauguration as the President of the United States for a second term, and in capital letters he wrote, there will be all hell to pay. That is a promise President Trump will keep.
We're coming to the end, but I just want to ask you, I mean, it's after 7 months, I think it was, in the first Trump administration, you resigned. You said that forces, quote unquote, in opposition to Trump's policies had forced you out. I'm wondering whether you think those same forces are going to be present in the second Trump administration.
I think I addressed that about 12 minutes ago. I said one of the biggest difference between now and then is that we will not allow subversive saboteurs into the building, such as John Kelly or Colonel Vinderman, who did everything they could to undermine the mission of President Trump to represent the will of 64 million Americans back then. Now it's going to be 77 million Americans who gave him a mandate. So no, one of the biggest differences is we will not have traitorous individuals like General Kelly or Colonel Vinderman inside the building undermining the writ of the American people.
Just lastly, you didn't mention John Bolton there, and I'm sure you've read...
Oh, John Bolton's not worth my time. He's a clown. He's an utter clown who goes on CNN. Well, what self-respecting Republican goes on CNN to bash his former boss? He's a sad little man with a laughable clown's mustache, so don't give him any oxygen, because I'm not going to.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us, Dr. Sebastian Gorka. Thank you.
God bless. Thank you.
Now, we can speak to David Miliband, the CEO and President of the International Rescue Committee and the former British Foreign Secretary. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us, Mr. Miliband. The International Rescue Committee, of course, responds to the world's worst humanitarian crises. You've just published this IRC annual emergency watch list. For the benefit of people who don't know, just tell us, what does this watch list reveal?
The International Rescue Committee is a humanitarian charity working to combat the consequences of war and disaster around the world. And each December, we do a statistical analysis of about 70 to 80 indicators, quantitative and qualitative, to rank the 20 biggest looming humanitarian catastrophes, the countries in which there are the greatest number of people in humanitarian need. In total around the world today, it's about 305 million people who depend on non-governmental organizations, charities, to survive. 3 of the top 6 are in the Middle East region, in Gaza and the West Bank, the occupied Palestinian territories, in Syria and in Lebanon. But top of the list is Sudan, which has 30 million people in humanitarian need. So the watch list is both an internal planning tool to help us gear up for the year ahead, but it's also a call to action to the wider world to recognize the needs that must be addressed.
Yeah, we're going to talk in more detail as the interview goes on about some of the specific countries in the top 5 in the rankings. But just going to that overall figure that you just articulated there, 305 million people in humanitarian need. I mean, that's up 4-fold on a decade. It was about 78 million in 2015. I mean, it really looks, doesn't it, like you're fighting a losing battle. We're all fighting a losing battle here.
Well, that's a very good point. Certainly the fact that there are now 59 conflicts going on around the world, that there are 42 non-state actors who are in control, de facto authorities. These are part of the syndrome that's seen this remarkable rise in humanitarian need. Now, it's also the case that this isn't just conflict that's driving humanitarian need, although that is the primary driver. There's also the climate crisis, which is exposing the most vulnerable parts of the world to extra danger. And in the last 2 or 3 years, there have been the consequences of higher interest rates and the economic drag anchor of a tougher economic climate. But these are all man-made. These aren't acts of fate. And the purpose of our watch list is to say that just as these have been created by human decisions, so the suffering of the civilians can be mitigated. I think it's important for your viewers to have in mind that more than 8 out of 10, 82% of the total number of people in humanitarian need are concentrated in just these 20 countries. Overall around the world, and you've seen this in the Middle East region, poverty levels are actually going down in stable states, but they're rising in conflict-affected, fragile states. Over the last 20 years, since the early 2000s, extreme poverty in stable countries has gone down by 30 to 40%. But in unstable, war-torn countries, it's gone up, and Syria would be a very good example. It's gone up. Sudan is obviously the prime example. It's gone up by nearly 90%.
I wanted to ask you about Syria. Of course, it's often called, well, it had been called one of the world's forgotten crisis, and that's indeed a term that was used by the IRC to describe the situation there. It's been on your watch list for several years. And I'm just wondering now, with developments these last 2 weeks, with the toppling of Bashar al-Assad, what do you think that's going to mean for this crisis?
Well, that's a very good point that you make, that we never took Syria off our watch list. We said it had been forgotten by others, but not forgotten by us. We had teams working in the northwest of Syria and in the northeast of Syria, in the rebel-held areas. And across Syria as a whole, 16 million people out of a remaining population of maybe 17, 18 million, almost the whole, very large swathe of the population were in humanitarian need. Of course, the total population of Syria at the beginning of the civil war was about 25 million, but 6 million refugees have left the country to Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, also Germany. UK has taken some. And so Syria was, as far as we're concerned, those who said the war was over, that President Assad had won, that felt to us like something that was detached from reality. Now, the situation today is that Syria well merits its place on our watch list with the 16 million people in humanitarian need. But if things go right, it shouldn't be on the watch list in a year's time. The trouble is we don't know. Obviously, there's a lot up for grabs. The new governing authorities are beginning to turn words into action. There's been some words about how Syria must be for all Syrians. Of course, Syria has a complex, diverse denominational population demographics. And the words have been about an inclusive government, an inclusive political settlement. That's obviously significant. Some refugees are coming back to Syria. The UN High Commission on Refugees says that up to 1 million will return in the first 6 months. But we also know that some minority groups are leaving. So it well merits its place on our watch list, but there is hope that in a year's time it won't be there.
And obviously, as we've been saying, a very fast evolving situation there, and really difficult to sort of make sense at this very early stage of what things are going to look like in a year from now. But in terms of the priorities for the IRC, what are you identifying as being the immediate things that need to be considered for helping the situation there?
You're talking about Syria, are you?
Syria, absolutely.
Yeah. And the most important priorities are, one, to make sure that there is an inclusive governing system. We worked in the northwest of Syria, where the armed opposition groups who are now in control of the whole country were in control before, and they let us get on with our business. We worked with the civil authorities to deliver humanitarian aid. We weren't told who to give aid to. We weren't told who to not to give aid to. Our funds were not interfered with. So that's very important. Secondly, it's vital that the health system of Syria, which in some ways has been significantly reduced, is sustained. Thirdly, there's a threat of hyperinflation, that the economic sustenance of the country is very, very important indeed. Obviously, that in part depends on engagement with the wider world. And obviously, from a humanitarian point of view, we want the border crossing points that were closed to humanitarian aid by President Assad to be opened up. So there are some immediate priorities that are really pressing.
And of course, there are some 7 million Syrian refugees living outside Syria, and some European countries are talking about suspending decisions on asylum claims by Syrian nationals. How concerned are you about what happens to them?
Well, obviously, Turkey has got 3 million refugees. They've talked very clearly about them going back. Lebanon, 1 million. Jordan, 500,000 to 1 million. And it's in everyone's interest that people are able to go back. Our stress is always that the returns need to be voluntary and they need to be safe. So European countries are saying, look, we don't know, we can't do an asylum adjudication at this point because it's impossible to say whether or not it's going to be safe for people to go back. We know that 2 weeks ago, people didn't feel safe to go back. They thought their sons and husbands would be brought into the army or worse. Now there's uncertainty. So you can understand that for a short period, there is stasis, there is an inability to make an asylum determination. But I think that the clear aim should be that Syria is safe enough for Syrians to go back.
Yeah, Gaza is also very high up the list of concerns for the IRC. And I'm just wondering how difficult it's been, given what's been happening there, to ensure that aid gets to those who need it the most.
Well, the situation in Gaza has been very, very difficult indeed. Gaza and the West Bank come out at number 2 on our watch list. Sudan, number 1, as I said earlier. Gaza is an extremely concentrated humanitarian catastrophe, to quote the UN Secretary General, and it affects 2 million people, 2 million Palestinians, as well as the 100 hostages who are still left in captivity. Though the needs of those people are absolutely enormous. We've been working on emergency medical work. We've been doing food and nutrition, water and sanitation. We've been trying to look after kids. But as the war goes on, the needs have just been absolutely astronomical. And of course, the health system has been all but destroyed in the course of the fighting. We've been clear that while we will ask our teams to carry on doing their work, these are local people who are hired within Gaza to do their work, the only sustainable way to protect civilians, to deliver aid, to protect aid workers, to release the hostages is to have a ceasefire. That's a political decision, not a humanitarian one, but we can make a humanitarian recommendation. And we've been arguing for a ceasefire for a very long time now as the only way to fulfill the humanitarian imperative. There have been some stories over the weekend that both sides, Hamas and Israel, are inching closer to an agreement to stop the fighting. Obviously, the sooner that happens, the better.
Indeed, and we've been getting reports of progress on that front. So, of course, we'll keep a close eye on developments. I wanted to ask you about Sudan. You mentioned it right at the beginning. Sudan, the biggest crisis now, and I understand the biggest humanitarian crisis in history. And I'm just wondering, why do we hear so little about it, and what can be done to change that?
Well, it's a very good question. I think we hear so little about Sudan because there's so much else going on. Some of what else is going on is significant, whether it be in respect of Syria or whether it be in respect of the global economy. Some of what else is going on is, frankly, superficial and gets probably too much time. But I think Sudan has been squeezed. The Sudan catastrophe has been squeezed. I mean, in 2003-04, when there were massacres in Darfur, it was a major global story. In late 1980s, the Sudan crisis was a major global story. The people of Sudan deserve to have their attention of the world on their situation, because 10% of the total number of people in humanitarian need in the world are in Sudan. A small number, maybe 1 million refugees, small by comparison to 30 million. 1 million refugees have gone into Chad. About 500,000, 600,000 have gone to South Sudan. Those are both poor countries. And so the strain and the stress on the people of Sudan is absolutely huge, as well as on the neighboring states. And our call has been not just on the parties to the conflict, the Sudan Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Force, to allow humanitarian aid to flow, which both of them have been blocking it, but also on the states that are supporting each side to stop. Because at the moment, both sides think they can win. They seem to have an endless supply of arms. And that is creating now an 18-month humanitarian disaster that threatens to become much longer. And Sudan has been top of our watch list twice. It's the largest humanitarian catastrophe in world history, as you point out. And there's very little hope at the moment that it's going to get better.
I mean, when we look at a report like the one that the IRC has just published, I mean, there seems to be an awful lot of very bleak and very depressing news contained in there. And of course, it's extremely important information. But when you're trying to get donors on board, maintain morale within the organisation, it's important, I'd imagine, as well, to have some uplifting findings, some uplifting stories. Has there been anything in the last year that stood out for you as being something that perhaps has given morale a little bit of a boost and said to you, this is all worth it?
Yes, there are many things, but as you've read the report, so you know that as well as the litany of suffering, we're very clear at the end of the report. We have 6 clear sets of recommendations about how aid can be better delivered, and the aid system can be reformed, how civilians can get access to aid, how civilian suffering can be eased by investing in anticipatory action because of climate crisis, how the economy needs to better support the most vulnerable people in the world in fragile and conflict states. So there's a clear agenda for action in our report, not just an agenda for disaster planning. And we are always clear that as a solutions-oriented NGO, our recommendations for what to do come from our clear evidence of what works. So over the last year, we've seen compelling evidence of our immunization drive in East Africa, of our water and sanitation work in Gaza, of our early child development work in the Middle East as well, of our anticipatory action for climate disaster in northern Nigeria. There is no excuse that we don't know what to do. We actually do know what to do. The question is whether or not it can get the funding to support it. And this is not just funding from Western countries. It remains the case that more than 80% of the world's humanitarian funding comes from Western countries. But Western countries don't represent more than 80% of humanitarian need in the world. We all need to share this burden much more fairly. Your own region, the Middle East, is now very wealthy in some ways. And those with power and responsibility and wealth, I hope, will in 2025 take a New Year's resolution to direct their wealth and power to some of the world's most vulnerable people.
Yeah, and of course we're going to have a fairly significant change in Washington in a month or so from now. I'm just wondering whether you're optimistic and what your outlook is for the year ahead with a change of administration at the helm of the most powerful country in the world.
Well, I'm an optimistic person, so I have a optimistic mindset. Obviously, we wait to see what President Trump does, because it's very important that while politics is about tweets and arguments and debates, I used to be in politics, when it comes to people's lives in the humanitarian field, we have to be more cautious. We don't respond in a knee-jerk fashion to what's said. I think that it's very important to recognize that the global engagement of countries like the United States can be for good or can be for ill. And it's very important that we make the case for how it can be for good. President Trump has obviously made some very clear statements about how he wants to focus on the home front. But as you say, the decisions in the US have global resonance, they have global implications, and there are requirements of global leadership that I think are very important.
Okay, well, we're out of time. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us, though. David Miliband, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Well, President Putin was asked about all these various issues at an annual year-end phone-in and news conference. Well, for more, we can speak to Abbas Galyamov, who's a former speechwriter for the Russian President, Vladimir Putin. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to ask you about this annual year-end phone-in and news conference. I'm just wondering how closely watched it is there in Russia.
Well, I watched all this a little more than 4 hours.
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Yeah, I watched it for the whole event, almost more than 4 hours.
What sort of viewership does it have? I mean, is it something that everyone in Russia tunes in and watches?
Not now. Look, when he just came, when he started this program, yes, it was extremely popular. But now, 25 years after, no, few people really, few people believe that he'll tell something interesting or he'll change something. Like, people got accustomed to that, well, yes, he can speak, he can promise, he's explaining everything nicely, but nothing is changing for the best in life, actually. Everything is changing from bad to worse. And so people are kind of disappointed.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, I mean, sometimes during these phone-ins, I'm told, although I don't understand what's being said because I don't speak Russian, but people call in, they ask questions that can be sometimes a little bit uncomfortable for the president to answer. Do people remain cautious, however, about what they ask him, or do people feel quite free to ask him really anything they want?
No, look, definitely Russia is not a free country now at all. Even 25 years ago, when it was pretty democratic, there was still the feeling of like, discipline. Like, this is a national leader. You cannot feel free, feel at ease with him. He's not just like a chap, old pal or your classmate whom you can talk anything about. Of course, it was not like it was never like this. Everyone had the feeling that he's like a big deal. And now when we have like not authoritarian, almost totalitarian state, you should understand what is happening in Russia. Well, in this case, of course, like everyone is afraid to say something which he wouldn't like. And actually, you should understand that this event is no longer free from the point of view of who are calling and who are talking to him. It's a pre-organized event with predetermined questions. It's all staged up. Almost nothing. Like 95% of the questions asked, they were controlled by his press officers. Like just several questions might be relatively free, and when they give floor to BBC or some other independent Western journalists, yes, those are free to ask anything, including something unpleasant for Putin. But no, like basically, Putin knows what they're going to ask. So just a few questions which are not controlled by Putin's office, like this.
Yeah, I mean, you've painted the picture of someone who's changed quite a lot over the years. That was the impression I was getting from your answer in the early part of it. And even by President Putin's own admission, one of the things that stood out for me is that he said that he jokes and laughs much less than he used to. I think he was saying this with regards to the war in Ukraine ongoing now and entering its fourth year, I should say. What do you read into this? What's your interpretation of why he said that? Do you think he is a much changed man?
I think he doesn't care for people being killed, but he's a good actor and he understands what to say and how to behave. So he understands that he should show like respect and being sorry with regard to all these people being killed, because like if he doesn't do it, he's out of touch with the country. You should understand that he's losing popular support now, like at speed which is constantly growing. And if he starts adding to this speed by doing such blunders, like showing that he doesn't care, well, he doesn't want to do this. So it's just staged up. It's just the matter of game. If he really cared for these people, he wouldn't have been doing what he is doing, because there are no objective reasons why there should be war.
We're going to talk a bit more about some of the content in the speech in just a moment, but I just want to ask you, since you wrote speeches for President Putin, I don't know how close your working relationship was, perhaps you can tell us, but what was it like working for him and writing speeches for him? Did he tend to stick to the speech, or would he go off script? Tell us a bit about him.
No, when I worked for him, I worked for him all in all 3 years, for 3 years, 1 year when he was president and 2 years when he was prime minister. So last time it was 2010, so it was pretty long ago. At that time, he was not sticking to the speech, to the script at all. If he felt that he was just opening the text and beginning to read it, and then if he wanted to add something, he would pick up his eyes. It's visible, actually. He's picking up his eyes. He starts speaking. Then he's coming back to the speech and speaking. Sometimes he's reading a little, then putting it aside and starts speaking. If he feels that he knows what he wants. So he's in this respect, he's quite able speaker. So it's not that he needs a written text for all the time. Basically, he needs it just to start, to set the train moving, and maybe to read while he's in the car going to the event. He has this text there in the car waiting for him, so he's maybe going through it, checking the facts and getting the ideas which he wants to express, and then he's speaking off the hand, freely, fluently.
Okay, so you're saying he's a gifted public speaker in Russian. He works hard and he's diligent on the speech. Now, going back to the content, he talked about Ukraine quite considerably. He talked about Ukraine. He talked about the fact that he is ready, quote, any time for talks with the incoming US President Donald Trump. He also talked about how he's ready for negotiations and compromises. He's sounding a lot more conciliatory, isn't he, than he was perhaps a year ago?
Well, the objective situation is that he needs to finish this war. In spite of his troops moving forward, the tensions, the strain, they are really hard. It's not only about the battlefield where his army is going through tremendous losses, and he really is lacking people now. Soon there would be no people for him to continue his advancement. But it's not only about this, it's about weaponry. His officials responsible for producing weapons, they are speaking that in current economic situation, they would all soon go bankrupt. Chemizov, the head of Rostech, the chief producer of the Russian arms, Russian weaponry, he spoke in the upper chamber of the Russian Parliament Federation Council something like two months ago, and he told that even export of weaponry is the most profitable industrial undertaking which you can imagine, is already becoming, under current financial situation, is already becoming unprofitable. So he's publicly telling that soon the whole industrial complex would collapse. So of course it's being told not like when you're speaking to officials, not like on this widely broadcast propaganda channels like today's event, but still people speak about this. So it's people, it's weapons, like the population is exhausted. People really want this to stop. There is no longer support for any war. People just want normalization. They want to come back to pre-war period. This is just their dream. Like the economy is crumbling, foreign policy, like he couldn't save Assad, which was his chief ally in the Middle East. His whole Middle Eastern policy just failed. Now it's in ruins because everything was everything came to Syria. Everything was based on tied up around Syria, and now Syria is the country where his chief ally is lying in ruins. So he cannot continue this for a long time. And you know, one more point. Trump came as an opposition to Biden, to the previous American administration. So it's a really good chance for Putin to restart relations with America and maybe try to normalize them, because the continuation of the previous this course, which was very inimical, unfriendly, like Cold War course, it definitely all the sanctions. It definitely leads towards ultimate ruin, and there is a chance to change that. So he should use this chance. Definitely, he understands it, because if he now makes enemy out of Trump, he made enemy out of Biden. Now he cannot afford to make enemy out of Trump. So he understands that. That's why he sounds more conciliatory than before. But of course, the question is how much he can yield, because he still needs to come back to Russia from the war with something which would look like victory. He cannot afford appearing in front of the elites, of population, without victory. What you lost to Ukraine, like this will completely ruin his image of a strong man, because, you know, like for many, many years, they were creating this feeling that Ukrainians, they're some they're like subordinate nations, some artificial state, failed state, artificial nation, you know, they're definitely not competitors to us. We are like a great power. And now we cannot win them. So either they are great power or we are not.
All right.
Putin cannot afford to come back without victory. So he has to combine these two things. Combine these two things, like not to make enemy with Trump, but then still try to get something from Trump.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Really appreciate you, though, taking the time to speak to us, Abbas Galyamov. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Bye.
Now, in recent weeks, US citizens, particularly in the state of New Jersey, have been gripped by panic over drone sightings lingering in the night skies. Well, adding to the mystery is the perception that the US government has been slow to respond, offering no clear explanation. Well, this has gone on to fuel numerous conspiracy theories. Some citizens and officials alike say they suspect the drones of being Iranian spy tools launched from so-called Iranian motherships. Others have suggested they could be extraterrestrials. Well, let's take a look at a video one person posted on X.
Someone called the cops on these lights. See, even the police, they're going crazy. These aliens are attacking.
Well, in an attempt to reassure the public, the US President Joe Biden has stated there is nothing, quote, nefarious about this drone phenomenon that's been observed along the country's east coast.
Nothing nefarious, apparently, but they're checking it all out. I think it's just one. There's a lot of drones authorized up there. I think one started and they all got it. Everybody wanted to get in the deal. But we're following it closely. So far, no sense of danger.
The US President speaking there, all amongst those from the US House Intelligence Committee who've spoken to reporters after Biden's address, was Representative Chrissy Houlihan, a Democrat, who reaffirmed that these drones were nothing to worry about. She also said that they were not related to foreign powers, nor, she said, did they belong to aliens, as she put it, little green men who are working on the American people. Well, despite all the attempts to reassure the US public, the Federal Aviation Administration has decided to temporarily ban all drone operations in several areas of New Jersey until the 17th of January. They say they will use deadly force against the unmanned vehicles if they believe they pose a threat to national security. Well, for more on this, we can speak now to the Mayor of Belleville, Michael Melham, and also to Ryan Hurd, who is the Mayor of Pequannock Township. Both towns, I should add, are in New Jersey. Let me start with you, Ryan. I mean, what is the situation in your town? Are there continued sightings? Is there continued alarm?
Yes. Well, number one, thank you for having me on. Last night was a little rainy and a little cloud cover, so we really didn't see any. But the night before, on my way to the high school for our Christmas concert, I was able to see 4. So here's the issue. The residents of Pequannock, as well as the residents of this great state of New Jersey, we want answers. And that's what we expect, whether you're in New Jersey, USA, or any country in the world. You know, the residents expect that the leaders are going to reassure us, that are going to answer our questions, that the leaders have our back. And here in the township of Pequannock, we feel that that is not happening.
Okay, let's speak to Michael in Belleville. You're the mayor of that town. I mean, what we were just hearing there from Ryan, does that ring true?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, every single mayor here in New Jersey is well united. I mean, this started for us here in New Jersey 4 weeks ago. It's been about a week since all the mayors were gathered really close to Trenton, our capital, for a briefing with our state police. And we were all invited to a call with the White House on Monday where the same talking points were reiterated. You know, nothing to see here. We're seeing manned aircraft, a lot of misidentification. But it's the communication that's coming out of the White House has been concerning. I mean, we just heard our president say nothing to see here. The Intelligence Committee members had a classified briefing, and they came out and said nothing to see here. But yet our Foreign Affairs chairman in the House is basically saying that he believes it's China. And yet another congressperson from New Jersey is saying it's an Iranian mothership off our coast. We need some clear communication. The absence of truth and transparency in this matter is doing nothing but fuel social media conspiracies.
There is this theory that there's some missing radioactive material out there, and that's why these drones are hovering in the skies above areas of New Jersey. I mean, Ryan, have you heard anything about this?
You know, as the mayor of Belleville was saying, unfortunately, by not giving us answers, you start having all of these conspiracy theories. And yes, I've heard that one. I've heard things about aliens. I've heard a bunch of things. Now, I will be honest with you. New Jersey does have an issue with aliens, but that has nothing to do with drones. The issue with the drones is we know that these drones are flying overhead. They're flying over critical infrastructure. They're flying over our townships. They're flying over our families and our friends. And this has nothing to do with politics because these drones are flying over Republicans and Democrats and independent houses. They're flying over people of all races and creeds and color and the whole 9 yards. As the mayor of Belleville said, this is something that's uniting us. And as Americans, we want answers, and we're not getting those answers. We're getting the same answers. We've called media attention to this since 2 Sundays ago. So this is almost 2 full weeks, and we're literally no clearer now.
Yeah, it's dominating headlines around the world. And Mayor Melham, I want to ask you about this theory about the missing radioactive material. And I'm also wondering if you can just tell me from what you've seen, what sort of a size are we seeing here of drone? I mean, some people suggesting they're the size of SUVs.
They are. So we were on the mayor's call with the White House, and there was one mayor who stood out and spoke up and said, listen, I've had something over my house. It's 6 feet wide. It's the size of a small car. I've had it not once, I've had it twice. And yet they keep telling us that we're seeing things that we're not seeing. They keep telling us that we're misidentifying. But back to the radioactive material. So I kind of sparked this thing yesterday in an interview in New York City. So let's just split this up. It is not a theory that there's radioactive material on the loose. We're aware of that. That came from a federal agency, the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Committee, on their .gov domain name. They talked about the fact that radioactive material was missing. Now, do I connect the two dots? Not necessarily. But do I believe that we do have our assets up in the sky, and since they are flying in a grid-like pattern, do I believe that they're searching and looking and potentially sniffing for something that might be considered a threat to us? I do.
So you think this sounds like some sort of act of incompetence, and someone is doing a bit of a recce to try to work out what happened to this missing radioactive material, and that's why no one's giving you clear answers. I mean, is that roughly your logic here, Mayor Melham?
I do believe, as the mayor said, we do have assets. We were told that from our state police, that we do have assets that are over our critical infrastructure. I do believe that those are ours. I lived through the Bush era, threat level warnings, different color codes, and at a certain threat level, we do certain things. So it's totally plausible to think that our government has some assets over our critical infrastructure. Like my friend here, the mayor, he's got reservoirs, within his boundaries. Do I think we have assets over those infrastructures? Yes. Do I also think that we are potentially searching and sniffing for something? I do. Do I think it's in particular that particular radioactive material? Not necessarily. I do think that we are aware of a threat, and I do think that we're potentially out there looking for it. And if that's the case, that's fine. Just tell the American people. I no longer think or question who's really in charge of the drones or who owns the drones. It's more about why are they up there? These are the questions that we want from our federal government.
I'd just like to ask you, Mayor Ryan Hurd. I mean, we're hearing a lot of people in the opposition. Obviously, there's a change of administration happening in the next month in the United States, and there are a number of Republicans who are suggesting that the current administration is withholding information about all of this. And I'm just curious because I was given to understand that people in the incoming administration were party to the same kinds of intelligence briefings as people in the current administration. I don't know if people are saying anything about that in the United States and why, therefore, there should be any doubt in the minds of people in the incoming administration about what the government's saying here.
Well, we would hope that they're transparent, but the reality is the current administration in America is grossly incompetent, to say the very least, possibly even nefarious. I mean, not only are they lying to the American people, they can't even lie correctly. One hand is not talking to the other, and we're getting Kirby and Mayorkas saying different things on different days, and yet we have, New Jersey State saying, putting a presentation together and saying that if you do see a down drone, stay away from it, call 911, call the bomb squad, don't approach without a hazmat, and close off 300 feet. I mean, that's kind of scary. So that's an issue. I'm hoping, I'm pretty much guaranteed that the administration that is coming in will absolutely fix this problem. With that said, the last time that President Donald Trump was in office, there were people working against him by not giving him correct information or withholding information. So my worry is that the things will still be the same. As Americans, we have to demand better as our elected leaders. If you're an elected leader of a town in New Jersey as a mayor or a councilman or something like that, we have a responsibility to a people. Whether it's, fixing potholes, picking up garbage, whatever that is, we're on the front lines. It seems as if the higher you go up in the elected leader role, the less connected you are with the people. And they tend to forget who they work for. In America, as an elected leader, you work for the American people, not for yourself. That's the whole job. And that's why last Wednesday, when all of these mayors got together, over 180 mayors out of this great state of New Jersey, and our governor wasn't even there, that's why we were so angry. That's your job. We expect you to be there. Whether or not you're going to add anything to the conversation, there's still an expectation.
Mayor Michael Melham, what are your thoughts on what's just been said?
Absolutely. I mean, we all heard Trump speak this past week. He said that our government knows. He said very clearly that our president knows. And when he was asked point blank whether or not he was going to come to New Jersey this weekend, he said no. So these are the questions that we're seeking. We know our federal government knows. You can't tell me that we don't know what's flying just hundreds of feet above our house. We have technology in this country, greatest country in the world. They could read your driver's license number from a mile up in the sky via satellite. Probably why it's still in your pocket, by the way. There's no way they don't know what's going on, and it's time for them to come clean and tell the American people what's happening in our airspace just over our heads.
Yeah, and Mayor Michael Melham, let me stay with you for just a moment because, I mean, obviously, this isn't necessarily a new phenomenon. I'm told there are something like 8,500 drones in the air above the United States at any one time. You know, this has become a hobby. There's lots of these bits of equipment around the place. But I mean, seeing what you're seeing in the skies above your house, above the town that you are mayor of, I mean, are you managing to sleep at night?
It's very difficult. My residents are anxious, they're concerned, they're worried, some are scared. And they, as the mayor just said, they look to us. We are the mayors on the ground here. We are closest to the people. They look to us for answers. We in turn look up to the state government, which has failed New Jerseyans, has failed us, their lack of communication. If I was the governor of New Jersey, I'd be in Washington right now demanding answers. And they're not getting the answers, which is concerning. But you're right. I mean, the facts are the facts. There's about 1 million drones here in the United States, about 800,000 drone operators / pilots. But here's what we know. We know the drones that are flying over our critical infrastructure are not emitting radio frequencies. These are not personal drones. These are not commercial drones. They're not emitting a radio frequency, which makes it very hard to down them. We can't jam them because they're not emitting radio frequencies, and our state police has told the mayors we have no idea where they're coming from and where they're landing. The fact that we can't chase these things. Our own governor said when we had a helicopter in the sky and got close to it, the lights went out and it disappeared. These are not personal drones. These are not part of that 1 million. This is clearly either a government operation or a foreign adversary. I'm on the belief that it's our government up there.
Mayor Ryan Hurd, are you encouraging people in your town to take matters into their own hands? I mean, some have suggested shooting these things down. We know that people in the United States, many people do carry arms. Is that something that people have been doing?
So first thing I want to say, absolutely in no way, shape, or form are we asking or encouraging anybody to shoot anything down. That's not what we do. Whether or not we have guns, yes, America has more guns per capita than any other place in this world, which makes America great. With that said, no, we are not going to be shooting any drones down. We are not going to be trying to catch any. We're not going to be sending up our hobby drones to try to take pictures of the drones. That is a federal government issue. Do I like them to shoot one down? Absolutely, over the ocean where nobody is and it's not going to cause any harm. The problem with any resident trying to do that is the unintended consequences. God forbid you were to shoot one down or catch one or anything, interfere with its operation, and it lands in your neighbor's house, killing 6 people. That's a big deal, and I don't want to have to report on that, and I don't want to have to deal with that. I never want that to happen. With that said, these are not class 1 or class 2 drones. So when we say drones, it's kind of like saying Kleenex. It's just a word that we're using for this. But the reality is when I say drones, a typical person is thinking about something, maybe the palm of their hands or the palm of 2 hands together. The reality is these are class 3 and class 4 drones. They're about the size of an SUV. They're much larger. As the mayor said, they are not emitting any frequency. So it's thinking as this is a mission that is pre-programmed in the drone goes off, it does its grid pattern, and then it comes back to wherever that is. We need answers. We need answers now, and we expect our government to do much better. But I expect the residents of my town not to try to take things in their own hand. With that said, unfortunately, because of the way the world is today, when you hear things about Syria, when you hear things about Ukraine, this is on mainstream media, it's on X, it's on YouTube, they see what's happening and how warfare has changed with drones. So the residents are asking, based on the size of these drones, is that something that can happen in New Jersey? And unfortunately, I have to say, that is a possibility. Now, I hope, with God's grace, it will never happen. But it's what everybody is seeing, and that is why our residents are staying up at night.
Yeah, indeed. And you're both mayors in a state that's home to several airports, Newark probably being the most famous of them to an international audience. We're hearing this report from the US Federal Aviation Administration. There's been something like a 269% increase in the number of cases of lasers being pointed at aircraft, presumably by members of the public, but we don't know that. Mayor Melham, I mean, how dangerous is this potentially?
It is, and I echo the mayor's sentiments. We are not advising residents to take the law in their own hands. Our skies, our federal airspace, if you do try and fire upon a drone, and again, a drone is considered an aircraft. If you do try and fire, it is a federal offense. That being said, here in Belleville, New Jersey, we're located in northern New Jersey. We border the largest city in New Jersey, Newark. We sit right smack in the middle of Newark International Airport airspace, as well as Teterboro Airport and the international airports of JFK and LaGuardia. We do have FBI guidance that's asking us to communicate to our residents, to inform them to stop using lasers. Pilots have reported landing and taking off. They are clearly being distracted. They have reports of pilots asking the FBI to have mayors here on the ground communicate to our residents to stop pointing laser pointers at these drones, or what they believe is a drone.
Okay, we're coming to the end. I'd just like to put that same question to Ryan Hurd, and I just want to wrap up and perhaps give you the last word here and ask you, a question that I've been wondering myself. I mean, what does it say about the United States today that so few people seem to believe what the authorities are telling them, and there's so much skepticism about what the government is and isn't saying?
Well, I'll be honest with you. This is exactly why it makes America great. Because the American people are not going to sit back and just accept what the government is telling us. That's the whole reason why this experiment that we call America is together. Our job as citizens is to challenge the government, to make sure that power is in check, to remind them that the government works for we, the people. That's the whole reason why we exist. I think this is a good thing on a couple of different ways. On one, we are challenging the government and we are showing the incompetence of our government today. And we, the people, will not stand for that. On another note, think of it like this. With these drones, if anything good is coming out of it, we have Christmas right around the corner where we're going to be celebrating with family and friends. This is something that has actually brought us together. You have the mayor of Belleville, you have the mayor of Pequannock, and you have a whole bunch of other mayors that came together asking the same question, regardless of what our background or affiliation is. You have the American people that are now looking up into the sky and they're not looking into their phones as much. It's a great way to bring people together. And that is the reason why we, the people, make America so great.
Ryan Hurd, you have had the last word. Thank you very much indeed to you. Thank you as well to Mayor Michael Melham. Great to have had you both with us. Well, that's all we have time for on this special edition of Global News Today. Thank you for watching. Be sure to join us again very soon for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deep fake and artificial intelligence,
They've got to have a vote and a say.
it's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on The Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.